The most successful Wild West families weren't the ones with the most cattle or biggest gardens. They were the ones who discovered what to do with something everyone else was throwing away. This winter survival trick was so effective, it's shocking we abandoned it entirely. Winter on the frontier wasn't just cold, it was a death sentence wrapped in snow and ice, delivered with the kind of brutal efficiency that made even the toughest homesteaders question their life choices. While folks back east worried about their tea getting cold, frontier families faced months of complete isolation from the outside world. No grocery stores, no supply wagons, no backup plan, except what they'd managed to scrape together before the first blizzard hit. Most of these families had never lived through anything like this before. They came from cities or established farms where food appeared somewhat regularly, where neighbors lived close enough to borrow a cup of sugar, where starvation was something that happened to other people in other places. Out here, different story entirely. The arithmetic was simple and terrifying. A typical homestead sat anywhere from 20 to 100 miles from the nearest town. When winter storms rolled across the prairie, they didn't just bring snow, they brought complete whiteout conditions that could last for weeks. Temperatures dropped so fast that a pot of soup left outside would freeze solid before you could say supper's ready. We're talking about cold that made your breath freeze in mid-air and turned your spit into ice before it hit the ground. But here's what really kept families awake at night: the knowledge that they were completely on their own. No rescue teams, no emergency supplies, no calling for help, because help was probably frozen solid somewhere 50 miles away, assuming it existed at all. When your food ran out, that was it. Game over. The survival rate tells the whole story. Historical records show that roughly 1 in 4 homestead families didn't make it through their first winter. Some froze to death when their fuel ran out. Others succumbed to diseases that would have been easily treatable in civilization, but a shocking number simply starved. They sat in their crude cabins, watching their food supplies dwindle day by day, calculating whether the hardtack would last until spring, knowing the answer was probably no. What made it worse was how unprepared most families were for the sheer brutality of prairie winters. Back east, winter meant bundling up for a trip to the general store. Out west, it meant potentially not seeing another human being for 4 solid months. The wind didn't just blow, it screamed across the open plains with nothing to stop it, driving snow horizontally and creating drifts that could bury entire buildings. Then there's the psychological torture of it all. Families would huddle together in one-room cabins, eating the same monotonous meals day after day, watching their children grow thinner, wondering if this would be the winter that finally broke them. The darkness didn't help either. Winter days were short and often grey, leaving families sitting in dim cabins lit by flickering candles or oil lamps, if they were lucky enough to have fuel for them. Smart families started preparing in late summer. They knew that everything, and I mean everything, depended on those crucial months of August, September and October. This was when the real work happened. Hunting season, harvest time, the frantic rush to gather, preserve and store enough food to last until spring decided to show up again, which might not be until April or May. The ones who survived learned quickly that winter wasn't just about having food, it was about having the right kinds of food stored the right way. Fresh vegetables, forget it. Fresh meat, only if you were lucky enough to hunt successfully, or if the weather stayed cold enough to keep a carcass frozen. Most families lived on a rotating menu of preserved foods that would make modern people gag just thinking about it. Every decision became a matter of life and death. Do we eat the last of the bacon now or save it for next month? Can we risk burning extra wood to cook a hot meal, or should we eat cold hardtack again? Is that meat still good, or will eating it kill us faster than not eating it? These weren't philosophical questions, they were daily survival calculations that determined whether families would see spring. The cruel irony was that winter itself became both enemy and ally. Those same freezing temperatures that threatened to kill families also preserved their meat supplies better than any icebox. Nature provided a massive, reliable freezer that kept food from spoiling, assuming families could keep it cold enough but not so frozen that they couldn't actually eat it. Well, understanding the harsh reality is just the beginning. Because once you grasp how desperate the situation really was, you start to appreciate the ingenious ways families managed to survive. And it all started underground, with vegetables that could literally mean the difference between life and death, if you knew how to store them properly. When you're facing 4 months of frozen hell with no grocery store in sight, root vegetables become your best friend. Actually, they become more than that. They're literally the difference between seeing spring and becoming fertilizer for next year's crops. Potatoes ruled the underground kingdom of survival. These humble brown lumps could last 6 months without spoiling if you stored them right. Families would dig massive holes in the ground, line them with stones, and create what they called root cellars. The trick was keeping these underground vaults at exactly the right temperature, cold enough to prevent sprouting, but warm enough to avoid freezing solid. But here's where most homesteaders learned the hard way. Your root cellar had to stay above freezing but below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Miss that sweet spot by even a few degrees, your entire winter food supply would either rot into black mush or freeze into rock-hard chunks that required an axe to break apart. Many families spent their first winter eating frozen potatoes that tasted like soggy cardboard mixed with dirt. Carrots were the orange heroes of winter survival. Unlike their potato cousins, carrots actually got sweeter as the temperature dropped. Smart homesteaders would leave them in the ground under thick layers of straw, digging them up throughout winter like buried treasure. The funny thing about frontier life, kids today complain about eating vegetables once in a while. These families ate the same 3 carrots for dinner every single night for months. Then there were beets, the blood-red workhorses that nobody really wanted to eat but everyone needed to survive. Beets lasted longer than almost any other vegetable, and provided crucial nutrients when fresh food disappeared. Homesteaders would slice them thin, pickle them in vinegar, or throw them into every stew imaginable. Some families got so sick of beets they'd rather go hungry. But hunger has a way of making anything taste acceptable. Onions became the flavor saviors of winter cooking. Without them, every meal tasted like boiled leather mixed with sadness. A good onion harvest meant the difference between food that kept you alive and food that made life worth living. Homesteaders would braid onions together and hang them from cabin rafters, creating edible decorations that actually served a purpose. The sharp smell also helped mask other less pleasant cabin odors during those long winter months. Cabbage deserves special mention because it taught homesteaders one of their most valuable lessons about preservation. Fresh cabbage only lasted a few weeks, but fermented cabbage, what we call sauerkraut today, could last until summer. German immigrants brought this knowledge with them, and it saved countless American families from scurvy and starvation. Let's not forget the engineering marvel that made all this possible, the root cellar itself. These weren't just holes in the ground. They were sophisticated storage systems that required real skill to build correctly. You had to dig below the frost line, which could be 4 feet deep or more depending on your location. The walls needed proper drainage to prevent flooding. Air circulation was crucial to prevent mold and rot. Smart homesteaders would test their root cellar temperatures with primitive thermometers made from mercury or alcohol. Others relied on the hand test. If you could keep your bare hand in the cellar for several minutes without it going numb, the temperature was probably right. Not exactly scientific, but it worked often enough to keep families alive. The daily routine of winter vegetable preparation was mind-numbing in its repetition. Every morning, someone had to trudge through snow to the root cellar and haul up enough vegetables for the day's meals. Every potato had to be checked for soft spots and sprouting eyes. Every carrot needed scraping and cleaning. Every onion required careful peeling to remove the outer layers that had dried and toughened during storage. Root vegetables also taught homesteaders creative cooking techniques they never imagined they'd need. Potato pancakes made from grated raw potatoes stretched limited supplies. Carrot soup provided vitamins when nothing else was available. Beet greens, saved from the fall harvest and dried, could be added to stews for extra nutrition. The weird part about relying so heavily on root vegetables was how they affected people's health in unexpected ways. Families eating mostly potatoes developed different nutritional deficiencies than those eating primarily carrots and beets. Some homesteaders learned to rotate their vegetable consumption like modern nutritionists recommend, while others stubbornly ate their favorite vegetables until health problems forced them to diversify. What many people don't realize is how much physical strength was required just to access stored vegetables during harsh winter weather. Root cellars could be buried under 3 feet of snow, with entrance doors frozen shut. Breaking through ice-covered cellar doors with limited tools while wearing bulky winter clothing was exhausting work that had to be done regardless of weather conditions. Of course, even the best root cellar couldn't store vegetables forever. By late winter, families were eating potatoes with long green sprouts and carrots that had gone rubbery and soft. But as spring approached and these stored vegetables began to dwindle, homesteaders faced an even bigger challenge: finding fresh protein to keep their families alive. The art of preserving meat would prove even more crucial than mastering vegetable storage. Fresh meat in the Wild West didn't come with expiration dates stamped on neat plastic packages. Without refrigeration, a freshly killed animal had maybe 24 hours before it started turning into a science experiment nobody wanted to taste. Homesteaders learned quickly that wasting meat meant potentially starving later. The smoking process became an art form born from desperation. Families built smokehouses from whatever materials they could scrap together: old boards, mud, stones. The key was creating just enough heat to dry the meat without cooking it completely. Too hot? You'd end up with jerky that cracked like old leather. Too cool? Bacteria would throw a party in your winter food supply. Salt was worth its weight in gold on the frontier. Literally, a barrel of salt could cost more than a month's wages. But it was the difference between eating well all winter and gnawing on frozen turnips until spring. The salt curing process pulled moisture from meat like a sponge, creating an environment where harmful bacteria couldn't survive. Smart homesteaders covered entire sides of beef in thick salt layers, then wrapped them in canvas and hung them in the coldest part of their cabins. But here's where frontier life got interesting. Winter temperatures dropped so low that the entire outdoors became nature's deep freezer. Families would hang butchered animals outside their cabins, where they'd freeze solid within hours. The trick was keeping them frozen until needed and protecting them from hungry wolves, bears, and other settlers who might be running short on supply. Processing an entire animal at once wasn't optional. When you killed a cow or managed to bring down a deer, every single piece had to be dealt with immediately. Nothing got wasted. The choice cuts became steaks for immediate eating. Tougher portions went into the smokehouse. Scraps became sausage mixed with whatever fat and spices the family could spare. Even bones were cracked open for marrow or boiled into soup stock that could stretch for days. Jerked meat, what we'd call beef jerky today, was the ultimate survival food. Thin strips of meat were laid over wooden racks and either smoked slowly or dried in the sun and wind. Done properly, jerked meat could last months without spoiling. Cowboys carried strips of jerky in their saddlebags because it was lightweight, packed with protein, and wouldn't go bad during long cattle drives. The smoking process required constant attention. Someone had to tend the fire day and night, keeping the temperature steady and the smoke flowing. Too much smoke made the meat taste like eating a campfire. Too little meant the meat wouldn't preserve properly. Experienced homesteaders could judge the temperature by holding their hand over the meat. If they could keep it there for 4 or 5 seconds, the heat was just right. Canning meat was another preservation method, though it required precious glass jars and metal lids that were hard to replace on the frontier. Families packed cooked meat into jars with salt and sealed them tight. When done correctly, canned meat lasted for years. When done wrong, it created botulism that killed entire families. The steaks were literally life and death. Winter's brutal cold became the homesteader's best friend for meat storage. Temperatures that dropped to 20 or 30 below zero kept meat frozen solid for months. Families built ice houses, basically insulated sheds packed with blocks of ice cut from frozen ponds. Meat stored in these ice houses stayed fresh well into spring, assuming the structure held up and animals didn't break in. Then there's the reality that most homesteading families had never butchered anything larger than a chicken before heading west. City folks who decided to try frontier life often had no idea how to turn a living cow into winter food supplies. They learned by necessity, by watching neighbors, and sometimes by making mistakes that cost them dearly. The fat from butchered animals was almost as valuable as the meat itself. Rendered fat, called tallow, could be used for cooking, making soap, waterproofing boots, and even burning in lamps when oil ran out. Every ounce of fat was carefully collected and processed. Nothing that could help a family survive got thrown away. Smart families shared large kills with neighbors, creating informal networks of survival. If the Johnson family brought down an elk, they'd share portions with 3 or 4 neighboring families. When the Smiths managed to butcher a cow, they'd return the favor. This sharing system meant everyone had variety in their diet and insurance against their own hunting failures. Processing meat in winter meant working with frozen hands in brutal cold. Blood froze on knives within minutes. Fingers went numb handling cold meat and sharp tools. Yet families had no choice but to work quickly and efficiently, because leaving meat unprocessed meant losing precious calories their bodies desperately needed. The techniques that kept frontier families fed through harsh winters required skills most modern people have never learned. But these preservation methods meant the difference between survival and becoming another unmarked grave on the prairie. Speaking of survival foods that lasted through brutal winters, nothing was quite as reliable as what families could grow and store underground. While homesteaders carefully rationed their preserved foods, fresh meat remained a constant obsession during winter months. The difference between surviving and thriving often came down to one skill: hunting small game when everything else seemed frozen solid. Rabbits practically threw themselves at desperate families during harsh winters, These creatures were so abundant on the frontier that they'd hop right into cabins seeking warmth. Smart homesteaders didn't waste precious gunpowder on such easy targets. Instead, they mastered the art of wire snares, simple traps that caught dinner without making a sound. Setting snares required more strategy than most people realize. You couldn't just throw wire loops around and hope for the best. Successful trappers studied rabbit trails in the snow, looking for the packed-down paths these animals used repeatedly. They'd set their snares about 4 fingers high off the ground, just the right height to catch a hopping rabbit around the neck. The beauty of snares was their efficiency. One family could set 20 traps in an hour, then check them twice daily. During peak winter months, a well-placed line of snares might catch 3 or 4 rabbits every morning. That's enough fresh meat to feed a family of 6 for several days, assuming they stretched it with whatever vegetables they had left. But rabbits weren't the only game worth pursuing when snow covered everything else. Prairie chickens and partridges offered occasional variety, though catching these birds demanded different tactics entirely. These ground-dwelling birds would burrow into snowdrifts during blizzards, creating perfect opportunities for patient hunters. Here's where winter hunting got interesting. Desperate times called for creative measures. Families would fashion crude nets from whatever rope or cloth they could spare, then use children to flush birds toward the traps. The kids would make noise on one side while adults waited with nets on the other. Worked better than you'd expect, especially when entire flocks huddled together for warmth. Tracking became an essential skill that separated successful families from those who went hungry. Fresh snow told stories if you knew how to read them. Rabbit tracks showed small round prints in sets of 4, with the back feet landing ahead of the front ones. Bird tracks revealed which direction flocks were traveling and where they might roost for the night. Smart hunters learned to follow predator tracks too. Where you found fox or coyote prints, you'd often find their prey nearby. These wild hunters were actually doing half the work, concentrating game animals in specific areas where homesteaders could focus their efforts. The harsh reality was that families ate anything with fur or feathers during the worst months. Squirrels, although small, provided enough meat for a decent stew when combined with stored vegetables. Even mice weren't off limits when starvation threatened. Some families ground up small rodents entirely, bones and all, mixing them into cornmeal mush for extra protein. Winter hunting required tools that most homesteaders had to make themselves. Wooden clubs worked well for finishing trapped animals quickly and quietly. Sharp knives were essential for field dressing game before it froze solid. Many hunters carved their own arrows from whatever wood they could find, saving precious bullets for larger game or emergencies. Ammunition was liquid gold on the frontier. A single rifle cartridge cost about a day's wages for most settlers. That's why successful winter hunters became experts with silent weapons. Slingshots made from leather scraps could bring down birds at surprising distances. Throwing sticks worked well for stunning small game that got too close to cabins. The weird part about winter hunting was how the cold actually helped preserve fresh kills. Animals caught in the morning would stay fresh all day in freezing temperatures, giving families time to properly process the meat. This natural refrigeration meant hunters could take their time butchering properly instead of rushing to prevent spoilage. Processing small game in winter required specific techniques to maximize every bit of nutrition. Rabbit fur was saved for lining boots and mittens. Bones were cracked open to extract marrow, which provided crucial fat calories. Even tiny bird bones were boiled into broth that added flavor to bland root vegetable stews. Some families got so good at winter hunting that they actually preferred it to summer months. Snow made tracking easier, and small game concentrated around shelter areas where they were easier to find. Plus, there were no flies or other insects to ruin fresh meat within hours of a kill. Children as young as 8 learned to set and check snares daily. This wasn't child labor, it was survival education. Kids who mastered winter hunting skills often meant the difference between their families living or dying during the harshest months. Weather determined everything about winter hunting success. Clear, cold days were perfect for tracking and setting new snares, but blizzards trapped both hunters and prey, creating desperate situations where families had to rely entirely on whatever they'd already caught and preserved. The most successful winter hunters understood that small game wasn't just about meat, it was about maintaining hope and variety during months of monotonous preserved foods. But even the best rabbit snares couldn't solve one critical problem that killed more homesteaders than starvation itself. Getting food was only half the battle. Finding clean water during winter months nearly killed more homesteaders than starvation itself. The stuff looked harmless enough sitting there in frozen ponds and streams, but appearances deceived desperate families every single day. Most settlers had never heard of typhoid, dysentery, or cholera before heading west. They learned about these killers the hard way. Entire families would drink from the same contaminated source and die within weeks of each other. The Hartley family in Nebraska lost 4 children in 8 days after drinking from a seemingly clean creek. Their neighbor found them all in February, frozen in their cabin. Wells presented their own nightmare scenarios during harsh winters. The water would freeze solid, sometimes down 20 feet or more. Homesteaders spent hours each morning trying to break through ice thick enough to walk on. Some families lowered burning logs down their wells, hoping to melt enough ice for a day's worth of drinking water. Others poured boiling water down the shaft, only to watch it freeze before reaching the bottom. Smart settlers learned to keep their wells working by covering them with thick wooden planks and piling manure on top. The decomposing waste generated just enough heat to prevent total freezing. Gross? Absolutely, but it beat dying of thirst while surrounded by frozen water. Then there was the slough water situation. These shallow wetlands dotted the prairie landscape, and desperate families often had no other choice. The water looked clean enough under its layer of ice. Break through that frozen surface though, and you'd find months of accumulated animal waste, rotting vegetation, and dead creatures that had fallen in during warmer months. Every drop of slough water required boiling for at least 20 minutes. Families burned through precious fuel supplies just making water safe to drink. The Kowalski family in Dakota Territory calculated they used nearly a third of their winter wood supply just purifying water. When their fuel ran low in February, they faced an impossible choice: freeze to death or risk deadly diseases from unboiled water. Some homesteaders tried melting snow instead of dealing with contaminated sources. Fresh snowfall seemed pure and clean, especially compared to murky slough water. But melting enough snow for a family of 6 required constant fire tending. 1 bucket of snow might yield only 2 cups of actual water. A family could burn through a week's worth of fuel just meeting their basic drinking needs. Winter storms complicated everything. Blizzards could dump 3 feet of snow overnight, but that same storm might contaminate the fresh powder with dirt and debris. Wind-blown snow picked up animal droppings, dust, and anything else lying around. Smart families learned to collect only the top layer of fresh snowfall, avoiding anything that had been sitting on the ground. Storage became another massive headache. Water left outside froze solid within hours during the coldest months. Inside the cabin, families had to keep water containers near the fire to prevent freezing. This meant hauling heavy buckets indoors every evening, and back outside each morning. The constant lifting and carrying wore down already weakened winter bodies. Wooden water barrels cracked when their contents froze solid. Iron containers burst their seams. Families learned to keep water moving or slightly warm to prevent expansion damage. Some buried containers partially underground, hoping the earth's warmth would prevent total freezing. The really clever homesteaders developed water rotation systems. They'd keep 3 containers going at once. 1 freezing outside, 1 thawing inside, and 1 ready for immediate use. This required careful timing and constant attention, but it meant always having drinkable water available. Coffee became a survival tool beyond just warming cold bodies. The boiling process killed dangerous bacteria while creating something that actually tasted decent. Many families drank nothing but coffee and boiled water for entire winter months. Children as young as 5 learned to drink strong coffee because it was often safer than plain water. Some settlers discovered that adding a splash of vinegar to questionable water helped kill harmful organisms. Others dropped hot coals directly into wooden buckets, boiling the water from the inside out. These techniques worked, but they required supplies most families couldn't spare. The truly desperate resorted to drinking their own urine or melting ice formations from inside their cabins. Survival instincts pushed people toward choices they never imagined making back in civilized towns. When death from dehydration seemed imminent, any liquid looked appealing. Water testing meant risking someone's life with each new source. Families would designate the strongest adult to try questionable water first. If they got sick, at least the children and weaker family members remained healthy enough to care for everyone else. The irony wasn't lost on homesteaders surrounded by frozen water everywhere, yet constantly threatened by thirst and waterborne diseases. Success meant planning water sources as carefully as food supplies. Those who figured out safe, sustainable water systems survived. Those who didn't joined the countless graves dotting the frontier landscape. But even families who mastered winter water challenges still needed basic foods that could last months without spoiling. The foundation of winter survival started with simple ingredients that wouldn't kill you. 50 pounds of flour could mean the difference between seeing spring or dying in a frozen cabin. Most homesteading families ordered this amount every few months, knowing it would stretch maybe 8 weeks if they were careful. Really careful. Flour wasn't just for bread. Smart families turned it into hardtack, those rock-hard biscuits that could survive a nuclear blast and still be edible. The recipe was dead simple. Flour, water, salt, and a tiny bit of sugar if you were lucky enough to have any. Mix it up, roll it flat, cut it into squares, and bake until it turned into something resembling edible granite. These biscuits earned their nickname tooth dullers for obvious reasons. Biting into fresh hardtack was like chomping down on a brick. But here's the genius part. They lasted forever. Months, sometimes even years if stored properly in a dry place. Weevils might move in eventually, but desperate people just called that extra protein. The trick to eating hardtack without breaking your jaw was soaking it first. Drop a piece into hot coffee and wait. The liquid would slowly penetrate the concrete-like surface, turning it into something your teeth could actually handle. Some families crumbled it into stews where it worked like dumplings, soaking up flavor while adding bulk to thin broths. Then there's the morning routine that kept families alive. Wake up, stoke the fire, put coffee on to boil, and drop hardtack pieces right into the hot liquid. 20 minutes later you had something resembling breakfast. Not delicious, but it filled the empty spaces in your stomach and gave you energy to face another freezing day. Flour also became pancakes when families had eggs or milk to spare, but winter pancakes weren't the fluffy stacks we know today. These were thin, dense affairs cooked in bacon grease. If bacon grease was available, more often they were cooked dry in whatever fat could be scraped from previous meals. Let's not forget flour gravy, the miracle food that made everything else edible. Brown some flour in hot fat, add water slowly while stirring, and suddenly you had something that could cover bland root vegetables, or make hardtack actually taste like food. Gravy turned boring into bearable, and bearable into survivable. But flour had enemies. Moisture was the biggest threat. One leak in the roof, one crack in the storage barrel, and your precious flour supply could turn into a moldy disaster. Families learned to seal flour containers with everything they could find. Candle wax, tar, whatever worked, to keep dampness out. Weevils were another nightmare. These tiny bugs would infest flour supplies, turning smooth powder into a crawling mess. Some families just sifted out the bugs, and kept using the flour anyway. Protein was protein, and waste meant death. Others heated their flour in Dutch ovens to kill the invaders before they could multiply. Temperature swings created their own problems. Flour stored in freezing cabins would absorb moisture when temperatures warmed, then freeze again, creating ice crystals that ruined the texture. Smart homesteaders kept small amounts inside their living spaces, rotating from their main outdoor storage as needed. The weird part is how creative desperation made people. When flour ran low, families stretched it by mixing in ground acorns, cattail root powder, or even finely ground tree bark. These substitutions changed the flavor and texture, but they added bulk to precious supplies. Some families discovered that day-old hardtack could be ground back into flour-like powder, using whatever grinding tools they had. This recycled flour worked for thickening stews or making thin pancakes. Nothing went to waste when survival was on the line. Winter baking required serious planning. Every handful of flour had to count because running out before spring meant trouble. Families would carefully calculate how much they needed for daily hardtack, how much for occasional bread, and how much to save for absolute emergencies. Making bread in winter was a special event. Real bread, not just hardtack, required careful temperature control and timing. Dutch ovens buried in coals could create bread, but using that much flour at once was a luxury most families saved for Sundays or special occasions. The families who survived had figured out flour rationing down to a science. They knew exactly how many hardtack squares each person needed daily, how much flour to use for thickening stews, and when to stretch supplies by mixing in substitutions. This wasn't cooking, it was survival mathematics. But flour alone couldn't keep families alive through brutal frontier winters. While those 50-pound sacks provided crucial calories and energy, bodies needed more than wheat to survive months of bitter cold. Another staple food provided essential nutrition that flour simply couldn't deliver, and smart homesteaders made sure they had plenty stored away before the first snow fell. Flour kept families alive, but cornmeal, that was the real game changer for winter survival. While wheat flour cost a fortune and spoiled if it got damp, cornmeal was cheaper, lasted longer, and packed way more energy per pound. Smart homesteaders bought 25 pounds of cornmeal for every 50 pounds of flour. The math was simple: cornmeal stretched further and kept you warmer when the temperature dropped below zero. But here's what most people don't know about frontier cornmeal. It wasn't the fine powdery stuff you buy at the grocery store today. This cornmeal was coarse, gritty, and sometimes still had bits of corn kernel mixed in. Families ground their own corn using hand crank mills, and let me tell you, that was back-breaking work in freezing weather. Your hands would go numb after 10 minutes of cranking, but you kept going because stopping meant your family might starve. The real secret weapon wasn't just plain cornmeal mush though. Native American tribes taught desperate settlers how to make something called sagamite, and this knowledge saved thousands of lives during brutal winters. Sagamite mixed cornmeal with whatever natural sweeteners families could find: maple sap, wild honey, or even tree bark syrup. The result was an energy-dense survival food that could keep a grown man working in sub-zero temperatures for hours. Making sagamite required timing and technique that most homesteaders had never learned back east. You couldn't just dump cornmeal in boiling water and hope for the best. The cornmeal had to be slowly stirred into hot liquid water, milk if you were lucky, or melted snow if you were desperate. Too fast and you'd get lumps harder than rocks. Too slow and the whole mixture would burn to the bottom of your pot, wasting precious food and fuel. Then there's the sweetener problem. Maple sap only flowed during specific weather conditions in early spring, so families had to collect and preserve every drop they could get. Wild honey meant risking bee stings and angry swarms, but a single hive could provide enough sweetener to make sagamite palatable for weeks. Some families got creative with birch bark syrup, or even boiled down wild fruit juices from the previous summer. The weird part about sagamite was how filling it actually was. One small bowl could satisfy hunger for 6 to 8 hours, even when you were chopping wood or hunting in deep snow. Modern nutritionists would tell you it's because cornmeal provides complex carbohydrates and the natural sugars give quick energy, but frontier families just knew it worked. A handful of sagamite eaten slowly could trick your stomach into feeling full when there wasn't much else to eat. Cornmeal mush became the default breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner for families running low on other foods, but eating the same bland mush day after day drove people crazy. Some families added salt pork drippings to make it taste like something other than warm paste. Others mixed in wild onions or dried berries when they could find them. The lucky ones had a little butter or cream to stir in, turning basic cornmeal into something almost edible. Storage was another challenge most people never consider. Cornmeal attracted mice, rats, and insects like nothing else. Families stored it in wooden barrels or metal containers, but rodents could chew through almost anything when they were hungry enough. Some homesteaders learned to add bay leaves or cedar chips to keep bugs away, while others hung their cornmeal in cloth bags from the ceiling where mice couldn't reach. What really made cornmeal valuable wasn't just nutrition, it was versatility. You could make thin gruel when food was running low, thick porridge when you had enough to spare, or even primitive cornbread if you had eggs and a little fat. Desperate families mixed cornmeal with snow to make a cold paste that would at least put something in their stomachs during the worst blizzards. The preparation became a daily ritual that consumed hours of precious time. Someone had to tend the fire, stir constantly to prevent burning, and portion everything carefully to make supplies last. Children learned to eat their cornmeal slowly, making each spoonful count, because there might not be more until the next day. Cornmeal saved lives, but it came with a price. Families who ate mostly corn-based foods for months developed pellagra, a disease that caused skin problems, digestive issues, and mental confusion. They didn't understand vitamins back then, but they noticed that people who ate only cornmeal got sicker than those who mixed in other foods. By February, even the best sagamite started tasting like cardboard mixed with tree sap. But salt pork, that was the difference between surviving winter and actually having enough energy to work. The fat content changed everything about frontier survival, and homesteaders who understood this lived while others didn't. While root vegetables kept families from starving and cornmeal provided the carbs they needed, nothing was more crucial for winter survival than fat. Pure, life-saving fat that came wrapped in salt and smoke. Salt pork and bacon weren't just food, they were portable heating systems that kept homesteaders alive when temperatures dropped to bone-chilling lows. Here's what most people don't understand about frontier winters. Your body burns through calories like a furnace when it's fighting to stay warm. A typical homesteader needed almost twice as many calories in January as they did in July. Where do those extra calories come from? Fat, lots of it. 25 pounds of bacon could feed a family of 4 through an entire winter. But this wasn't the crispy breakfast strips you know today. This was thick, heavily salted slabs that looked more like leather than food. The salt content was so high it could make your mouth pucker just from touching it. Makes sense, right? That salt was doing serious preservation work. The process started in early fall when temperatures dropped just enough to keep meat from spoiling during processing. Families would slaughter their pigs and immediately cut the meat into manageable chunks. Then came the salt cure, packing every piece in coarse salt for weeks until the meat turned rock hard. The salt pulled out moisture and created an environment where bacteria couldn't survive. But here's where it gets interesting. The fat content in salt pork was often higher than the actual meat content. What looked like a mistake was actually genius survival planning. Fat contains more than twice the calories per ounce compared to protein. When you're burning through energy just to keep your core temperature stable, those fat calories become liquid gold. Let's not forget the cooking versatility this stuff provided. Salt pork could be fried, boiled, baked, or thrown into stews. The rendered fat became cooking oil for everything else. Homesteaders saved every drop of bacon grease in jars and crocks, using it to fry potatoes, flavor vegetables, and even spread on hardtack like butter. The weird part is how bacon grease became a form of currency. Families traded it with neighbors who ran low on cooking fat. Some homesteaders valued a jar of rendered pork fat more than actual money. Money couldn't keep you alive when you were snowed in for 3 weeks straight. Storage required serious strategy. The meat had to stay cold enough to prevent spoilage, but not so cold that it froze solid. Frozen salt pork became nearly impossible to cut or cook. Many families built special meat houses, small structures designed to maintain that perfect temperature zone just above freezing. Then there's the preparation ritual that happened almost daily. Someone had to chip off chunks of salt pork with an axe or heavy knife. The salt coating made it slippery and dangerous to handle. More than one homesteader ended up with serious cuts trying to prepare their daily protein in dim cabin light. But why was bacon specifically so popular compared to other preserved meats? Simple economics and practicality. Pigs were easier to raise than cattle, required less feed and produced more usable fat. A single pig could provide enough preserved meat and cooking fat to last months. Cattle might give you more total meat, but they couldn't match the fat-to-meat ratio that made survival possible. The cooking process became an art form. Experienced homesteaders knew exactly how long to soak salt pork to remove excess salt without losing flavor. Too little soaking left it inedibly salty. Too much soaking made it bland and removed the preservative protection. Getting it right meant the difference between a satisfying meal and choking down something that tasted like salted leather. Most families developed their own techniques for making salt pork more palatable. Some added wild herbs during the curing process. Others mixed it with whatever vegetables they had stored. Creative cooks learned to balance the intense saltiness with sweet elements like maple syrup or dried fruit. The psychological impact shouldn't be underestimated either. Having a reliable supply of fat and protein provided mental security that went beyond basic nutrition. Families knew that as long as their salt pork supplies lasted, they wouldn't starve. That certainty helped people maintain hope during the darkest winter months. And the weird part is how this preserved meat connected families to their past. Many homesteaders learned salt curing techniques from parents or grandparents who lived through previous hard times. The knowledge passed down through generations like precious family heirlooms. Commercial salt pork was available at trading posts, but it cost serious money. Most families couldn't afford to buy enough preserved meat to last an entire winter. Learning to cure their own pork became essential for economic survival, as much as physical survival. Well, all this talk about preserved pork and bacon might sound filling, but homesteaders needed more than just protein and fat to stay healthy through those brutal winters. Their bodies craved something else entirely, something sweet that could prevent a deadly disease that killed more pioneers than most people realize. After months of eating the same root vegetables and hardtack, homesteaders craved something sweet. Their bodies weren't just asking for sugar, they were literally dying for vitamin C. Without it, scurvy would kill you faster than a blizzard. Dried fruits became the candy store of frontier survival, but getting them required planning that started back in late summer when fresh apples hung heavy on wild trees. Families would slice apples paper thin and spread them across their wagon roofs like edible shingles. The prairie sun did the rest, turning fresh fruit into leathery strips that could last through February. Apple leather was pure genius. You could chew it slowly and taste something that reminded you of apple pie, even when you're sitting in a freezing cabin eating it with frozen fingers. Kids would get one piece after dinner if they'd been good. Adults saved theirs for the darkest winter days when hope felt as thin as the dried fruit itself. The process wasn't complicated, but timing was everything. Wait too long, and the first frost would ruin your entire apple harvest. Start too early, and the fruit wouldn't be sweet enough to make the tedious work worthwhile. Smart homesteaders watched the skies like their lives depended on it, because they did. Then there's the ingenious way they handled preservation. Dried fruit strips were tied together with twine and hung from cabin rafters like strange Christmas decorations. The dry winter air kept them from spoiling, while the constant wood smoke from heating fires added a subtle flavor that you couldn't get any other way. Wild plums got similar treatment when families could find them. These tough little fruits grew in creek beds and ravines, usually in places where you had to fight through thorns to reach them. But plum leather was worth every scratch. It concentrated all the fruit's natural sugars into chewy strips that provided quick energy during the coldest days. Berries presented a different challenge. Strawberries, blackberries, and raspberries couldn't be sliced like apples. Instead, families would mash them into flat cakes and dry them on wooden boards. The result looked like purple or red cardboard, but it tasted like summer when winter felt endless. Some families got creative with fruit jellies and preserves. Sugar was expensive and hard to get, so they'd use maple sap or honey when they could find it. These sweet preserves transformed rock-hard hardtack into something that almost resembled dessert. Almost. The vitamin C in these dried fruits prevented scurvy, though most homesteaders didn't understand the science. They just knew that families who ate dried fruit stayed healthier through winter. Scurvy would make your teeth fall out, and your old wounds reopen. Children would develop rickets, and adults would feel weak all winter long. Wild rose hips provided another source of vitamin C that many families overlooked. These bright red seed pods formed after wild roses finished blooming. They tasted incredibly sour but packed more vitamin C than oranges. Smart settlers would dry them and steep them in hot water to make tea that tasted terrible but kept everyone healthy. But here's what made dried fruit truly valuable. It was portable protein for hunting trips. A man could stuff his pockets with apple leather and have enough energy to track deer for hours. The concentrated sugars provided quick fuel that meat alone couldn't match. Storage became an art form during the wettest months. Dried fruit had to stay completely dry, or it would mold within days. Families kept their precious fruit supplies in wooden boxes lined with cloth, stored in the driest corners of their cabins. One leak in the roof could ruin months of careful preparation. Trading dried fruit between families created informal networks across the frontier. A family good at preserving apples might trade with neighbors who specialized in drying berries. These food swaps often meant the difference between surviving winter and slow starvation. The weird part is how much work went into what we'd consider a simple snack today. Every piece of dried fruit represented hours of labor. Finding the fruit, hauling it home, slicing it perfectly thin, arranging it for drying, turning it regularly, storing it properly. But when you're facing 4 months of winter with no grocery store, that work felt like time well spent. Children learned to make dried fruit the same way they learned to read, as an essential life skill. Little hands were perfect for the detailed work of slicing apples thin enough to dry properly. Kids who mastered fruit preservation early often became the family experts by their teenage years. Winter nights got a little brighter when someone pulled out a precious piece of apple leather to share. The sweetness reminded everyone that spring would eventually return. Those small moments of sweetness kept spirits up when everything else felt hopeless. While dried fruits provided crucial vitamins and much-needed variety, they couldn't solve every nutritional problem. Families still needed protein and fat to survive the brutal cold months ahead. When you think about harsh winter survival, milk and butter probably don't come to mind first, but for homesteaders who managed to keep dairy animals alive through brutal frontier winters, these foods became liquid gold. A cow that could produce milk in January meant the difference between children getting proper nutrition and watching them slowly waste away from malnutrition. Keeping a milk cow alive during prairie winters was harder than most people realize. These animals needed shelter from howling winds that could freeze them solid in hours. Homesteaders built crude lean-tos against their cabins, using whatever scraps of wood they could find. The cow basically became a family member, because losing her meant losing a critical food source that could keep everyone alive until spring. Fresh milk in winter provided something no preserved food could match: immediate nutrition that didn't require cooking fuel to prepare. When firewood ran dangerously low, and every piece had to be saved for heating the cabin, cold milk straight from the cow filled empty stomachs without burning precious resources. Kids could drink it right away instead of waiting for adults to build fires and heat up frozen salt pork. But here's where things get interesting. Homesteader women discovered they could make butter simply by putting cream in a jar and shaking it while doing other chores. The constant motion of daily work, walking, cleaning, even just staying warm by moving around, would churn that cream into butter without any special equipment. Some women tied cream jars to their belts and let normal movement do all the work. 10 pounds of butter was considered essential for winter survival, and families would do almost anything to get it. Butter provided concentrated calories that helped bodies generate heat during blizzards. A single spoonful contained enough fat to keep someone warm for hours. Children were often given small chunks of butter to suck on like candy. It sounds gross now, but that fat was exactly what their growing bodies needed to survive sub-zero temperatures. The weird part is how homesteaders stored dairy products without refrigeration. They used winter itself as a massive freezer. Milk was poured into containers and left outside, where it would freeze into solid blocks within minutes. When they needed milk, they'd break off chunks and thaw them near the fire. Frozen milk tasted different than fresh, but desperate families weren't worried about flavor preferences. Then there's the whole egg situation. Chickens were incredibly valuable because they could produce protein even in winter, if you could keep them alive. Smart homesteaders brought chickens inside their cabins during the worst storms. Yes, that meant living with smelly, noisy birds, but fresh eggs in February were worth the hassle. One egg contained more nutrition than a whole bowl of hardtack mush. Women learned to preserve eggs in ways that sound completely bizarre today. They'd coat fresh eggs in lard or bury them in containers filled with salt. Some packed eggs in boxes of grain, where they'd stay fresh for weeks. Every preserved egg was precious because chickens laid fewer eggs during short winter days, and sometimes stopped laying entirely when temperatures dropped too low. Homesteader families developed clever tricks for making dairy products last longer. They'd mix fresh butter with salt and pack it tightly in containers, pressing out every air bubble. Salted butter could last months without spoiling, even in fluctuating temperatures. Some families made so much salted butter in fall that they'd trade it with neighbors for other survival foods throughout winter. But dairy products came with serious risks. Milk spoiled incredibly fast if left at the wrong temperature. Too warm and it turned into stinking, dangerous liquid that could poison the whole family. Too cold and it froze so hard that thawing it took forever and wasted precious fuel. Homesteader women became experts at judging exactly when milk was about to spoil and had to be used immediately. The families who managed to keep dairy animals alive through winter had significant advantages over those surviving on just preserved meat and hardtack. Fresh milk provided vitamins that prevented scurvy and other diseases that killed homesteaders who ate nothing but dried foods for months. Children who got regular milk and eggs grew stronger and were more likely to survive harsh frontier conditions. Smart homesteaders planned their dairy production around winter survival needs. They'd breed cows to give birth in late fall, ensuring peak milk production during the coldest months when fresh food was most desperately needed. Timing this correctly required knowledge that many families learned through deadly trial and error. Mistakes often meant losing both the cow and the calf. What made dairy products truly luxurious wasn't just their taste or nutrition. They provided variety in diets that otherwise consisted of the same few foods eaten day after day for months. A cup of fresh milk or a piece of buttered bread broke the crushing monotony of survival eating and gave families something to look forward to. Of course, not every homesteader could manage dairy animals through winter, but those resourceful enough to keep cows and chickens alive discovered another crucial advantage. When spring finally arrived and neighbors were desperate for fresh food, families with dairy products had valuable trading goods that could be exchanged for other necessities they'd need for the coming year. After weeks of eating hardtack that could break your teeth and salt pork that made you thirsty for hours, homesteaders desperately needed something different. Something that wouldn't leave their stomachs growling an hour later. Beans and legumes became the unsung heroes of frontier survival, and families who figured this out early had a massive advantage over those who didn't. Black-eyed peas were absolute champions in the worst soil conditions imaginable. All while other crops failed miserably in the rocky, nutrient-poor dirt that defined most homestead land, these tough little legumes actually thrived. They didn't need perfect conditions or fancy fertilizers, they just needed a chance. Smart homesteaders planted them everywhere they could find a patch of dirt, knowing these plants would literally pull nitrogen from the air and feed it back into the soil. The protein situation gets interesting here. When your last strip of jerky disappeared and hunting came up empty for days, beans stepped in like a nutritional backup plan. A cup of cooked beans delivered nearly as much protein as a chunk of meat, but lasted months longer in storage. Families learned this lesson the hard way during their first brutal winter, when they watched their precious meat supplies dwindle, while bags of dried beans sat untouched in the corner. Dried legumes had an almost magical quality for winter survival. Unlike fresh vegetables that rotted within days, or meat that spoiled faster than you could eat it, properly dried beans remained edible for entire seasons. Some varieties lasted over a year when stored correctly. The key was keeping them bone dry and protected from mice, which meant storing them in sealed containers or hanging them in cloth bags from the cabin ceiling. But here's where many newcomers made a critical mistake. They'd throw dried beans straight into a pot and wonder why dinner turned into a jaw-breaking ordeal. Experienced homesteaders knew the secret. Soaking beans overnight in whatever water they could spare transformed these rock-hard nuggets into something actually edible. The beans would double in size, soften considerably, and cook much faster the next day. Bean mash became the foundation for countless frontier meals that kept families alive during the darkest months. You'd take your softened, cooked beans and mash them up with a bit of saved bacon grease or salt pork drippings. Add some wild onions if you were lucky enough to find them. This created a thick, filling paste that stuck to your ribs for hours. One bowl of properly made bean mash could satisfy hunger in a way that hardtack never could. The cooking process required patience that desperate families didn't always have. Beans needed to simmer for hours over consistent heat, which meant feeding the fire constantly and watching the pot. But rushing this step meant tough, indigestible beans that would leave you hungrier than when you started. Experienced cooks learned to start their beans early in the morning, letting them cook slowly throughout the day while they handled other survival tasks. Then there's the variety factor that kept people sane during monotonous winter months. Navy beans, kidney beans, lima beans and black-eyed peas each brought different textures and flavors to the table. Families who had planned ahead during planting season could rotate between different types, making their meals feel less repetitive. This psychological boost mattered more than you might expect when facing months of identical daily routines. Smart homesteaders discovered that beans paired perfectly with their other stored foods. Mix beans with cornmeal, and you've got a complete protein that rivals meat. Combine them with stored root vegetables like onions and carrots, and suddenly you have something approaching a real stew. Add them to whatever small game you managed to catch, and you could stretch a single rabbit into meals for days. The weird part about bean storage was how it required almost no special equipment. Unlike meat that needed smoking sheds or root vegetables that demanded carefully constructed cellars, beans just needed to stay dry and protected. Many families stored their winter bean supply in simple cloth sacks hung from cabin rafters, well above where mice could reach but easily accessible when cooking time came. Reusing cooking water became an art form with beans. The liquid left after cooking beans contained dissolved nutrients and flavor that homesteaders couldn't afford to waste. This bean liquor became the base for soups, could be used to soften hardtack, or even drunk as a thin but nourishing broth when food ran dangerously low. Families who mastered bean cookery developed their own secret techniques passed down through generations. Some added pine needles for flavor and vitamin C. Others discovered that certain wild herbs could transform bland beans into something almost enjoyable. These small improvements made the difference between merely surviving winter and maintaining some quality of life during the hardest months. Beans represented hope in the most practical sense possible. While you waited for spring planting season and prayed your stored meat would last, those bags of dried legumes provided security. They promised that no matter how bad things got, you had something reliable to fall back on. Coffee presented its own unique survival challenges that went far beyond simple morning comfort. Cowboys didn't just drink coffee, they practically lived on it. When supplies ran dangerously low and the nearest town was weeks away, these frontier families discovered something that sounds absolutely disgusting but kept them alive: coffee gravy. Picture this bizarre concoction. You take your morning coffee grounds already used 3 or 4 times because nobody could afford to waste a single bean. Then you mix those soggy grounds with bacon drippings and whatever flour you have left. Stir it all together over a fire until it thickens into something that looks like brown sludge. Congratulations. You just made breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The weird part? It actually worked. Coffee provided caffeine to keep people alert during those long, dangerous winter nights when wolves howled outside thin cabin walls. The bacon fat delivered crucial calories that helped bodies generate heat in sub-zero temperatures. And that flour, even mixed with old coffee grounds, filled stomachs that might otherwise go empty for days. But coffee served purposes that went far beyond basic nutrition. During winter months when families might not see another human being for weeks, that daily coffee ritual provided psychological comfort. The familiar smell, the warmth of the cup in frozen hands, the few minutes of sitting quietly before facing another day of survival, these small moments kept people sane. Smart homesteaders learned to stretch their coffee supplies using tricks that would make modern coffee lovers cringe. They'd brew the same grounds up to 5 times, adding just a pinch of fresh coffee to each new pot. When desperate, they mixed in chicory root, acorns, or even roasted grain to make their real coffee last longer. Some families kept detailed logs of how many times they'd used each batch of grounds, tracking every precious brew. The preparation process became almost ceremonial. Coffee had to be made strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe, as cowboys liked to say. They'd boil water in whatever container they had, usually a battered metal pot that had seen better days. Then they'd throw in a handful of coffee grounds, let it boil for several minutes, and settle the grounds with a splash of cold water or an eggshell if they were lucky enough to have one. Here's where things get interesting and gross. When coffee ran completely out, frontier families got creative with substitutes that would horrify any modern barista. They roasted wheat berries until they turned black, then ground them up for wheat coffee. They dried and roasted dandelion roots, which actually produced a surprisingly coffee-like bitter drink. Some even tried roasted sweet potato peels, though most agreed this tasted like drinking dirt. Coffee also served as medicine during harsh winter months. Parents gave weak coffee to children suffering from stomach problems, believing the hot liquid would cure whatever ailed them. Adults used coffee to stay awake during medical emergencies or when taking turns watching sick family members through long nights. Whether it actually helped or not, the psychological boost was undeniable. Let's not forget the social aspect of coffee in isolated homesteads. When neighbors visited a rare and precious event during winter months, the coffee pot immediately went on the fire. Sharing coffee became the ultimate gesture of hospitality, even when families could barely afford to spare the grounds. These coffee visits provided crucial opportunities to share news, trade supplies, and maintain the human connections that kept people from going completely mad during months of isolation. The quality of coffee available to homesteaders varied wildly depending on their location and financial situation. Wealthy families might have real coffee beans shipped from distant cities, while poor settlers made do with whatever brown liquid they could create from local plants. Most families fell somewhere in between, carefully rationing small amounts of genuine coffee beans to last through the entire winter. Cowboys and homesteaders developed an almost mystical relationship with their coffee preparation. They swore by specific brewing methods, argued about optimal water temperature, and guarded their coffee-making secrets like family heirlooms. Some insisted that coffee tasted better when brewed in a pot that had never been washed, just wiped clean with a rag. Others claimed that adding a pinch of salt enhanced the flavor and reduced bitterness. The timing of coffee consumption became strategically important during winter survival. Morning coffee provided the energy needed to face daily chores like feeding animals and chopping wood. Afternoon coffee offered a warm break during the coldest part of the day. Evening coffee helped people stay alert while tending fires that could mean the difference between life and death if they went out during blizzards. When spring finally arrived, families often discovered they developed dependencies on their coffee rituals that lasted long after the survival necessity ended. The habits formed during those desperate winter months, the careful rationing, the creative substitutions, the ceremonial preparation, became permanent parts of frontier culture. But coffee wasn't the only liquid that determined winter survival. Water, the most basic necessity of all, presented challenges that killed entire families who underestimated its importance. Shooting a massive buffalo or elk sounds like hitting the jackpot on the frontier, right? Well, that celebration lasted about 5 minutes before pure panic set in. These animals weren't your typical Sunday dinner chicken. A full-grown buffalo could weigh over 2,000 pounds, and homesteaders had maybe 18 hours before that mountain of meat started turning into a rotting disaster. The clock started ticking the moment the animal hit the ground. Winter temperatures helped, sure, but even freezing weather couldn't save improperly handled meat. Smart hunters knew to make the kill as close to home as possible, dragging a dead elk 3 miles through snow. That was a nightmare nobody wanted to live twice. The weird part is, many settlers had never butchered anything larger than a rabbit before heading west. They'd gone from buying neat little packages at the general store to facing down a beast that could feed their family for months. Buffalo provided the ultimate prize. These shaggy giants roamed the plains in massive herds during early homesteading years. One buffalo meant 800 matties, 1,200 pounds of usable meat, plus hide for clothing and shelter, bones for tools, and something else that might surprise you: buffalo tallow. That white, waxy fat became liquid gold during harsh winters. Settlers used it for cooking, making candles, waterproofing boots, and even fuel for lanterns. Nothing got wasted when survival hung in the balance. But processing required an entire community effort. Word spread fast when someone brought down big game. Neighbors appeared like magic, bringing knives, salt, and extra hands. Everyone knew the unwritten rule: help with the butchering, get a share of the meat. Makes sense, right? Next month you might need the same favor returned. The butchering process was brutal, bloody work that tested everyone's stomach. First came the skinning, which required sharp knives and steady hands. One wrong cut could ruin valuable hide or taint the meat underneath. Then the real challenge began: breaking down hundreds of pounds of muscle, organ meat and fat before spoilage set in. Women worked alongside men during these marathon sessions, their hands numb from cold but never stopping. Different cuts required different preservation methods. The tenderloin and choice steaks went straight into the family's immediate cooking pot. Can't let the good stuff wait. After all, tougher cuts got the salt treatment or went into the smokehouse. Organ meats like liver and heart were consumed first since they spoiled fastest. Frontier families ate parts of animals that would make modern people squeamish: kidneys, tongue, brain, marrow from cracked bones. Every protein source mattered when winter stretched endlessly ahead. Jerked meat became the backbone of winter survival. Thin strips of muscle were cut along the grain, then either smoked over low fires or hung to air dry in freezing temperatures. Properly made jerky felt like leather, but lasted months without spoiling. Kids grew up chewing these tough strips like candy, their jaws working overtime to extract every bit of nutrition. Then there's the smoking process itself. This wasn't some weekend barbecue hobby. Families built dedicated smokehouses using whatever materials they could scrounge. 4 walls, a roof and racks for hanging meat. The fire had to stay low and steady, producing smoke without cooking the meat too fast. Oak, hickory, or apple wood created the best flavor, but desperate settlers burned whatever they could find. The smoking process took days of constant attention. Someone had to tend those fires around the clock, feeding wood and monitoring temperature. Winter's brutal cold became nature's freezer, but even that had limitations. Meat frozen solid as rocks couldn't be cooked until it thawed. Smart families cached their frozen game in snowbanks or dug cold storage pits. The key was keeping it cold enough to prevent spoilage but accessible enough to retrieve during blizzards. Game meat tasted different from domestic animals too. Wild deer and elk were leaner, tougher, and had stronger flavors from their natural diets. Buffalo meat was surprisingly tender, but rich enough that small portions satisfied hunger better than larger servings of beef. Cooking methods had to adapt to these differences. Long, slow stewing broke down tough fibers. Adding whatever fat was available helped with palatability. The sharing aspect created survival networks across vast distances. When the Johnson family brought down a deer, the Millers got a hindquarter. 2 weeks later, Miller's successful elk hunt meant fresh steaks for the Johnsons. This wasn't charity. This was calculated survival insurance that kept entire communities alive during the harshest months. Processing wild game was exhausting, messy work that pushed families to their physical limits. But mastering these skills meant the difference between thriving and starving. Those who learned to efficiently handle large kills gained respect and security. Those who wasted precious protein rarely survived their second frontier winter. Speaking of survival skills, all this meat preservation was meaningless without knowing what plants could supplement these protein-heavy winter diets. When most people think about foraging in winter, they picture barren landscapes with nothing edible in sight. Well, homesteaders couldn't afford that kind of thinking. Their lives depended on knowing which plants could save them when the stored potatoes ran low and the last piece of salt pork disappeared into someone's belly. Wild onions were absolute gold during those brutal frontier winters. These weren't the neat, organized onions you'd find in today's grocery stores. These wild varieties grew in scattered patches, often buried under snow that had to be cleared away by hand. The bulbs were smaller, more pungent, and packed with flavors that could transform a bland pot of boiled roots into something that actually tasted like food. Finding them required skill passed down through families or learned from Native American neighbors. Wild onions had distinctive grass-like leaves that remained visible even in light snow. Experienced foragers could spot them from yards away. But here's the dangerous part. Several poisonous plants looked remarkably similar to wild onions. Death camas, for instance, could kill an entire family if someone made the wrong identification. Then there was pine needle tea, which sounds absolutely terrible until you realize it prevented scurvy. Scurvy killed people slowly and horribly. Near their teeth fell out, old wounds reopened, and they eventually bled to death internally. Pine needles contained enough vitamin C to stop this nightmare, but the tea had to be prepared correctly. Too hot, and the vitamin C was destroyed. Too weak, and it wouldn't provide enough nutrition. Different pine species produced different flavors of tea. Some tasted almost pleasant, while others were so bitter that people gagged trying to swallow them. White pine needles were considered the best choice. They produced a tea that was merely unpleasant, rather than absolutely revolting. Homesteaders learned to collect needles from the newer growth, which contained higher vitamin concentrations than older, darker needles. Rose hips provided another crucial source of vitamin C, but finding them in winter meant knowing exactly where rose bushes grew during warmer months. These bright red fruits stayed on the bushes well into winter, often partially preserved by freezing temperatures. Rose hips were incredibly sour and contained large hard seeds that could crack teeth if bitten carelessly. Smart families collected rose hips during late fall and dried them for winter use. The dried hips could be boiled into a vitamin-rich tea or ground into powder that added nutrition to other foods. Some women discovered that crushing rose hips and mixing them with a small amount of precious sugar created a paste that children would actually eat willingly. Cattail roots were the closest thing to finding buried treasure that frontier winters offered. These thick, starchy roots grew in marshy areas and could be dug up even after water surfaces froze solid. The roots contained enough carbohydrates to substitute for flour when ground and dried properly. But halving cattail roots in winter was backbreaking, dangerous work. Men had to break through ice, often standing in frigid water while digging through frozen mud with whatever tools they had available. Frostbite was a constant threat. Many men lost fingers or toes while gathering cattail roots, but starvation was a worse alternative. The roots had to be processed quickly before they spoiled. This meant peeling, cleaning, slicing and drying them within hours of digging them up. The dried slices could be ground into flour using hand mills or even clean rocks when proper equipment wasn't available. Knowledge of winter foraging often meant the difference between families that survived and families that didn't make it to spring. This wasn't information you could find in books. It was passed down through generations of people who had learned these skills through trial and error, sometimes fatal error. Native American tribes were often the original teachers of winter foraging techniques to struggling homesteaders. Tribal members had survived on these lands for generations and understood which plants remained edible through harsh winters. Some settlers were humble enough to learn from this expertise, while others were too proud and paid for their arrogance with their lives. Winter foraging required incredible amounts of energy for relatively small amounts of food. A full day of digging cattail roots might yield only a few pounds of edible material. Collecting enough pine needles for a week's worth of tea could take hours in deep snow. The calorie equation was brutal. Sometimes people burned more energy gathering food than the food itself provided. Weather determined everything about winter foraging success. A sudden blizzard could bury known food sources under feet of snow that wouldn't melt for weeks. Ice storms made digging impossible. Clear, cold days provided the best opportunities, but those same conditions created dangerous working environments where exposed skin froze within minutes. The most successful homesteaders combined their foraged winter plants with other survival foods to create meals that provided better nutrition than any single food source alone. But even the most skilled foragers knew that winter plants were supplements to stored foods, not replacements. When the Dutch oven came out for cooking, these wild ingredients transformed simple meals into something approaching actual cuisine. When you think about frontier cooking, forget everything you know about modern kitchens. These homesteaders had one magical piece of equipment that did absolutely everything. The Dutch oven wasn't just cookware, it was their entire kitchen rolled into one heavy black iron pot. Picture a cast iron pot with 3 legs and a flat lid. Sounds simple, right? Well, this thing could bake bread, that would make your grandmother jealous. Fry bacon to crispy perfection and simmer stews that kept families alive through the worst blizzards. The secret wasn't the pot itself, it was how these clever pioneers turned fire and coals into a precision cooking system. Here's where it gets interesting. They'd build a fire and let it burn down to red-hot coals. Then comes the magic trick that separated survival from starvation. Coals went under the pot for bottom heat. More coals got piled on top of that flat lid for oven heat from above. Suddenly you've got controllable temperature zones that would make modern chefs weep with envy. But the real genius was in the math. Want to bake bread? You needed twice as many coals on top as underneath. Roasting meat? Equal coals top and bottom. Just simmering a stew? Most coals went underneath, with just a few on the lid. These homesteaders became temperature wizards out of pure necessity. The 3 legs weren't just decoration either. They lifted the pot off the ground so coals could be arranged underneath without the pot sitting directly in the fire. Smart design that hadn't changed in centuries because it simply worked. No fancy thermometers or digital displays, just experience passed down from one freezing family to the next. Let's talk about heat retention, because this saved lives during those brutal prairie winters. Cast iron holds heat like nothing else. Once that Dutch oven got hot, it stayed hot for hours after the fire died down. Families would cook their evening meal, then wrap the pot in blankets and use it as a bed warmer all night long. 2 birds, 1 very heavy stone. These pots were workhorses that handled every cooking method imaginable. Morning meant frying salt pork and hardtack. Afternoon brought stewing whatever vegetables were left in storage. Evening meant baking bread if they had precious flour to spare. 1 pot, 3 different cooking techniques, and not a single dish to wash except the eating bowls. Then there's the size factor that modern people can barely comprehend. Frontier Dutch ovens were massive, some held over a gallon of food, had to be, because families were cooking for 6, 8, sometimes 10 people at once. Plus making big batches meant using fuel efficiently. Every piece of wood or buffalo chip had to count when temperatures dropped to deadly levels. The versatility blew minds even back then. Need to cook a whole chicken? Dutch oven could handle it. Want to bake a pie? Perfect. Making soap from animal fat? Yep, same pot. Even melting lead for bullets happened in these iron workhorses. Talk about getting your money's worth from a single purchase. Maintenance was crucial because replacement meant a 100-mile trip to the nearest town. Families seasoned their Dutch ovens with animal fat to prevent rust. After cooking, they'd wipe them clean but never used soap that would destroy the protective coating that built up over months of use. Proper care meant a Dutch oven lasted generations. Here's something that'll surprise you. Temperature control was incredibly precise once you learned the tricks. Experienced homesteaders could judge oven heat by holding their hand 5 inches above the coals. If they could hold it there for 8 seconds, perfect baking temperature. 4 seconds meant roasting heat. 2 seconds, time to pull some coals away before everything burned to charcoal. Winter cooking presented special challenges that pushed Dutch oven skills to the limit. Wind scattered coals and made temperature control nearly impossible. Snow melted and hissed when it hit hot iron. Fingers went numb handling hot coals with metal tongs. Yet families managed to bake bread in blizzards that would shut down modern cities. The social aspect gets overlooked, but Dutch ovens brought families together. Everyone gathered around while mother worked her magic with coals and timing. Kids learned by watching, absorbing knowledge that meant survival. Fathers told stories while tending the fire. These weren't just meals, they were daily lessons in staying alive. Smart homesteaders often owned multiple Dutch ovens in different sizes. Small ones for quick meals when fuel was scarce. Large ones for processing entire animals when hunting succeeded. Medium ones for daily family cooking. Each had its purpose in the delicate dance of frontier survival. But even the most skilled Dutch oven cook faced one constant challenge that tested every family's endurance. The fire had to keep burning, and fuel was always running low. Which leads us to an even more crucial frontier skill. Keeping sourdough starter alive through brutal frontier winters was like caring for an invisible pet that could literally mean the difference between life and death. These bubbling mixtures of flour, water, and wild yeast weren't just cooking ingredients, they were living organisms that homesteaders guarded more carefully than their gold watches. The science behind sourdough starters is actually pretty fascinating. Wild yeast from the air naturally ferments flour and water, creating a colony of beneficial bacteria and yeast that can live for decades if properly maintained. But here's the catch: kill your starter, and you're facing months without any fresh bread whatsoever. No corner bakery to run to when you mess up. Pioneer women treated their starters like newborn babies because that's essentially what they were. These cultures needed feeding every few days with fresh flour and water. Miss too many feedings. Dead starter. Let it freeze solid. Dead starter. Contaminate it with the wrong bacteria. You guessed it, dead starter, and possibly a sick family. The feeding schedule was ruthless during winter months. Smart homesteaders kept their precious starter containers near the warmth of wood stoves, but not too close. Too much heat killed the delicate balance of microorganisms just as surely as freezing temperatures did. Women learned to judge the perfect temperature by touch, keeping containers in spots that stayed consistently cool but never cold. Then there's the whole issue of flour rationing. Remember, families only had limited flour supplies to last entire winters. Using flour to feed a sourdough starter meant less flour for hardtack, less flour for thickening stews, less flour for emergency situations. Every handful of flour going to starter maintenance was a calculated risk that had to pay off in fresh bread. Sharing sourdough starters between homesteads became a sacred ritual that created bonds stronger than family ties. When a neighbor successfully maintained a particularly robust starter, she'd share portions with other families as insurance against disaster. These exchanges were treated like precious gift-giving ceremonies because everyone understood the life or death importance. The weird part is how these starters developed unique characteristics based on their environment. Starters in different regions, different cabins, even different corners of the same room would evolve distinct flavors and rising capabilities. The wild yeast and bacteria came from the local air, creating signature tastes that reflected their specific frontier locations. Sourdough worked better than commercial yeast in cold temperatures, which made it perfect for winter baking. Regular yeast often failed in the inconsistent temperatures of frontier cabins, but established sourdough starters were hardy enough to rise even when conditions weren't ideal. This reliability made sourdough bread a winter staple that families could count on. Baking sourdough bread in Dutch ovens required timing that would make modern bakers weep. Women had to judge oven temperatures by holding their hands over coals, estimate rising times without clocks, and manage dough consistency without measuring tools. The margin for error was basically zero. Waste ingredients on failed bread, and your family goes hungry. The process started by removing a portion of starter and mixing it with flour, water, and a pinch of precious salt. This dough had to rise near warmth sources, which meant juggling space around wood stoves that were already overcrowded with cooking pots and drying clothes. Timing the rise perfectly required experience that took years to develop. Many starters earned names and personalities within homesteading families. Old Reliable might be the starter that never failed to rise. Cranky Pete could be the temperamental culture that worked great some days and refused to cooperate others. These names reflected the very real relationships people developed with their invisible kitchen companions. Disasters happened regularly despite careful attention. Mice getting into starter containers, accidental contamination from dirty utensils, temperature fluctuations from poorly managed fires. Any of these could destroy months of careful cultivation in hours. Losing a well-established starter was genuinely mourning-worthy because replacing it meant weeks of uncertain attempts to capture new wild yeast. The most experienced homestead women developed backup systems that would impress modern scientists. They'd maintain multiple smaller starters in different locations, dry portions of healthy starter on cloth for emergency revival, and create networks with neighbors for starter sharing emergencies. These precautions often meant survival when primary starters failed. Winter maintenance required constant vigilance that added significant work to already overwhelming daily survival tasks. Women checked starters multiple times daily, adjusted their positions based on changing cabin temperatures, and calculated feeding schedules around diminishing flour supplies. This wasn't casual cooking. This was biochemistry with life or death consequences. Understanding how frontier families managed to create consistent food sources from such limited resources shows the incredible ingenuity required for basic survival. But maintaining living cultures was just one piece of the complex puzzle homesteaders faced when trying to keep food fresh through months of extreme weather conditions. When your nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away and the temperature dropped to 30 below zero, keeping food from turning into frozen rocks became a matter of life and death. Homesteaders couldn't just toss their winter supplies in a corner and hope for the best. One frozen potato could shatter like glass when you tried to cut it, and a barrel of completely frozen salt pork was about as useful as a wooden anvil. The root cellar became the homesteader's best friend during brutal winters. These weren't fancy basement storage rooms. They were holes dug straight down into the earth, usually 6 to 8 feet deep to get below the frost line. Smart families lined the walls with stones or wooden planks to prevent cave-ins, then covered the whole thing with thick layers of sod and hay. The trick was keeping the temperature just right, cold enough to preserve food but warm enough to prevent everything from freezing solid. But here's where it gets tricky. Root cellars worked great for potatoes, carrots and turnips, but they could turn into death traps for other foods. Too much moisture and your flour turned into a moldy mess. Too little ventilation and the whole space became a breeding ground for dangerous bacteria. Families learned to separate different foods carefully. Potatoes in one corner, apples wrapped in newspaper in another, and barrels of salted meat positioned where air could circulate around them. Then there's the problem of accessing your food storage during a 3-week blizzard. Many homesteaders built tunnels from their cabins to their root cellars, or at least created covered walkways. Nobody wanted to dig through 4 feet of snow every time they needed dinner. Some families even carved steps into the frozen earth, though those steps could become slick ice slides that sent people tumbling into their own food supplies. Ice houses represented the ultimate frontier luxury. Wealthy homesteaders cut massive blocks of ice from frozen rivers and ponds, then stacked them in specially built structures insulated with sawdust or hay. The ice stayed frozen for months, creating natural refrigeration that could preserve fresh meat well into spring. Poor families looked at ice houses the way modern people look at luxury cars. Nice to dream about, but way beyond their budget. Most families had to get creative with smaller-scale cold storage. They hung meat from the rafters of unheated outbuildings, where it would freeze solid within hours. The challenge was keeping it cold enough to stay preserved but accessible enough to hack off pieces for daily meals. Many homesteaders built small sheds specifically for frozen meat storage, positioning them on the north side of their property where the sun wouldn't warm them during brief winter thaws. Underground storage pits worked well for families who couldn't afford to build proper root cellars. They'd dig holes 3 or 4 feet deep, line them with stones, then cover everything with multiple layers of hay, canvas and dirt. These mini cellars kept vegetables from freezing solid while staying cold enough to prevent spoilage. The downside, digging through frozen ground in January to retrieve dinner ingredients was backbreaking work. Smart homesteaders learned to store food in multiple locations. Never put all your winter supplies in one place because if that storage area failed, your family starved. They'd keep some potatoes in the root cellar, some buried in outdoor pits, and some stored inside the cabin in wooden boxes packed with straw. This redundancy saved countless families when unexpected temperature swings ruined single storage areas. The cabin itself became part of the food storage system. Families hung strings of dried vegetables from ceiling beams, stored flour barrels in the coolest corners, and kept daily use items near the stove where they wouldn't freeze completely. But indoor storage meant constant battles with mice, rats, and other pests looking for easy winter meals. Nothing was more heartbreaking than opening a flour barrel to find it contaminated with rodent droppings. Temperature management required constant attention during extreme cold snaps. When the mercury dropped below zero for weeks at a time, even well-insulated root cellars could freeze. Families learned to place heated rocks or pans of warm coals in their storage areas during the worst weather. Too much heat and you'd spoil everything. Too little and you'd lose your food supply to the brutal cold. Well, the weird part is that some foods actually benefited from partial freezing and thawing cycles. Potatoes stored in root cellars that experienced slight temperature fluctuations often lasted longer than those kept at perfectly constant temperatures. The natural freeze-thaw process seemed to break down harmful bacteria while keeping the vegetables edible. Successful food storage meant understanding that winter storage wasn't just about keeping food cold, it was about managing moisture, air circulation, temperature stability and pest control all at once. But even the most carefully planned storage systems couldn't protect families when food supplies ran dangerously low and every meal had to be carefully calculated to last until spring. When the first blizzard hit, frontier families knew they were gambling with death itself. Their carefully calculated food stores had to stretch across months of isolation, and there was no room for error. One miscalculation meant watching your children slowly starve while snow piled higher than the windows. Rationing wasn't just about eating less, it was mathematical survival. Families would count every grain of rice, every strip of jerky, every precious spoonful of flour. They'd divide their winter stores into weekly portions, then hide those portions from themselves. Sounds crazy, right? But when you're staring at your last barrel of flour in January, human nature kicks in. People eat more when they can see abundance, even if that abundance needs to last 3 more months. Children got smaller portions than adults, and that's a harsh reality modern families can barely imagine. A 6-year-old might get half a biscuit while dad got a whole one. Not because parents loved their kids less, but because adults needed strength to hunt, chop wood, and defend the homestead. Dead parents meant dead children anyway. The weird part is how families developed elaborate hiding systems for their emergency reserves. They'd bury sealed jars of beans under the cabin floor. Salt pork got wrapped in oilcloth and hidden in fake walls. Some families even dug secret root cellars that other family members didn't know about. Trust was a luxury they couldn't afford when starvation was knocking. Then there were the blizzard calculations. When you saw those dark clouds building on the horizon, you knew you might be trapped indoors for 2 weeks straight. Maybe longer. Smart homesteaders kept what they called storm boxes, containers with enough hardtack jerky and water to survive if they couldn't reach their main food stores. These boxes stayed inside the living area, because frozen food was useless food when you were already burning your furniture to stay warm. But here's where things got really desperate. Families would start eating in shifts to make portions look bigger. Mom might eat breakfast while dad ate lunch. The psychological game was brutal. Seeing someone else eat made your own tiny portion feel less pathetic. Children learned to eat slowly, chewing each bite dozens of times to trick their stomachs into feeling fuller. Water rationing was equally critical during blizzards. You couldn't just step outside and grab snow when winds were howling at deadly speeds. Melting snow required precious fuel, and fuel meant the difference between freezing to death and making it to spring. Some families rationed themselves to 1 cup of water per person per day during the worst storms. Try drinking only 1 cup of water tomorrow, and you'll understand the misery. The most heartbreaking part was watching families ration children's portions even smaller when food started running dangerously low. Parents would pretend they weren't hungry, sneaking their portions to kids when they thought nobody was looking. But kids weren't stupid. They knew mum and dad were starving too. Some children refused to eat their portions, trying to save food for their parents. Entire families slowly starved together while trying to save each other. Let's not forget the emergency foods that weren't really food at all. When regular rations ran out, families started boiling leather harnesses into soup. They'd grind up tree bark and mix it with their last pinches of flour. Grass soup became a real meal when there was nothing else. These weren't recipes. They were death postponement strategies. Some homesteaders developed what they called famine schedules. They'd eat normally for 2 days, then fast completely for 1 day, then eat tiny portions for 3 days, followed by another complete fast. The idea was stretching food supplies while keeping their bodies from complete shutdown. Whether this actually worked better than steady rationing, nobody really knew. Starvation science wasn't exactly advanced back then. The cruelest irony was that many families died with emergency food still hidden away. They'd ration themselves to death while their secret reserves sat untouched, saved for an even more desperate day that never came. Fear of running out completely made them too conservative with portions that might have saved their lives. Trading networks between homesteads became lifelines during extended blizzards, but only if families had planned ahead. Neighbors might trade a pound of flour for 2 pounds of salt pork, but these deals had to be arranged before storms hit. Nobody was traveling through deadly blizzards to barter for beans. The families who survived were the ones who built these trading relationships during autumn, when handshake deals could still be made face to face. When the snow finally started melting and trails became passable again, something beautiful happened among scattered homesteads. Families who'd made it through the winter would begin trading and sharing in ways that created survival networks spanning hundreds of miles. When your nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, and the closest town might as well have been on the moon during a blizzard, survival depended on something most modern people have forgotten entirely. Trading food wasn't just about getting variety in your diet, it was literally the difference between making it to spring or becoming another sad story buried under the snow. Picture this. You've got barrels of salt pork, but your family is dying for something sweet. Your neighbor 3 homesteads over managed to preserve enough apples to last through winter, but their salt supply is running dangerously low. Sounds like a perfect trade, right? Well, it wasn't that simple when everything had to happen on horseback through knee-deep snow. Salt was basically frontier gold. Seriously, some families guarded their salt supplies like modern people guard their passwords. A 20-pound bag of salt could be traded for 50 pounds of flour, 2 chickens, or even a decent hunting knife. The reason was simple. Without salt, meat spoiled within hours. With it, that same meat could feed your family for months. Families who struck good salt trades often survived winters that killed their neighbors. But here's where things get interesting. Smart homesteaders figured out specialization faster than most business schools teach it today. The Johnson family might become known for smoking the best venison jerky for miles around. The Millers perfected their sourdough starter and could trade fresh bread for almost anything. Old Pete down the creek somehow kept his chickens laying eggs all winter long, making him richer than some town bankers when it came to trade value. These trading networks stretched across impossible distances. A jar of wild plum preserves might change hands 5 times, traveling over 100 miles from homestead to homestead. Each family added something to the chain, maybe smoking some meat, drying some vegetables, or crafting tools needed for food preparation. The weird part is how these informal networks worked better than most modern supply chains. Women ran most of these trading relationships. They knew exactly what each family needed and what they had to offer. Sarah might ride 15 miles through a snowstorm to trade 3 pounds of butter for a precious bag of coffee beans, because she knew her husband would go crazy without his morning coffee. These weren't casual grocery runs, they were calculated survival missions. Then there were the emergency trades that showed the brutal reality of frontier life. When the Peterson family's root cellar flooded and froze, destroying their entire winter vegetable supply, neighboring families had to make impossible choices: share their carefully rationed food and risk their own survival, or watch an entire family slowly starve. Most chose to share, creating debts that might take years to repay. Some families got creative with their trading goods. The Wright family discovered that pine needle tea prevented scurvy, so they became the unofficial pharmacy of their area. They'd trade bundles of prepared pine needles for meat, flour, or tools. Knowledge became as valuable as food itself. Families would trade recipes, preservation techniques, and hunting tips along with their physical goods. But hoarding could backfire spectacularly. The Henderson family tried to corner the local market on dried corn, refusing to trade with anyone unless they got ridiculous prices. When their own meat supply went bad early in the winter, nobody wanted to help them out. They barely survived on corn mush, and learned a harsh lesson about frontier community values. Trading posts, when they existed, became legendary meeting spots during winter months. These weren't fancy stores, usually just a cabin with a few shelves, but they served as neutral ground where families could gather, trade, and share crucial survival information. The post owner usually took a small cut of each trade, but also provided the invaluable service of knowing who needed what. Distance made timing everything. A family might send their oldest son on a 3-day journey to trade salt pork for dried apples, only to discover another family had beaten them there with a better offer. Coming home empty-handed could mean the difference between having enough food for the family versus having to decide which child gets a full meal. The most successful trading families kept detailed mental inventories of what everyone in their area had and needed. They knew the Murphy family always ran out of coffee by February. They remembered that the Joneses had terrible luck hunting but grew amazing turnips. This information became power and survival insurance. Spring trading was different but just as crucial. Families would trade away their remaining preserved foods for seeds, tools, or livestock needed for the coming year. A jar of pickled vegetables might buy enough garden seeds to prevent next winter's starvation. These trading relationships created bonds that lasted generations. Families who helped each other survive brutal winters became extended family networks across the frontier. But not every trade involved neighbors helping neighbors survive winter's worst months. Sometimes the real enemy wasn't starvation or cold, it was the challenge of actually preparing food when everything had to be done completely from scratch. Cast iron Dutch ovens weren't just pots, they were survival machines. These heavy black cauldrons could bake bread, fry bacon, and simmer stew all in the same day. The thick walls held heat for hours after the fire died down, which meant families could cook their evening meal and still have warm food at midnight. But here's what most people don't realize about frontier cooking. There were no temperature dials, no timers, no measuring cups. Everything was done by feel, smell, and generations of passed down knowledge. Women would hold their hands above the Dutch oven and count how long they could keep them there. 2 seconds meant blazing hot, perfect for searing meat. 5 seconds was medium heat for baking bread. 10 seconds was low and slow for tough cuts that needed hours to become tender. The coal placement technique was an art form that took years to master. Too many coals on top and your bread burned black on the surface while staying raw underneath. Too few coals on the bottom and nothing cooked evenly. Experienced frontier women could tell the exact temperature just by looking at how the coals glowed. Red hot meant danger, orange meant perfect baking heat, and when coals turned grey with white edges, that was the sweet spot for slow cooking tough game meat. Winter cooking meant every single calorie burned had to count. Gathering firewood in freezing temperatures was exhausting work that used up precious energy. Smart homesteaders planned their cooking around the fire's natural heat cycle. First, they'd use the hottest flames to sear meat and boil water. As the fire died down, they'd bake bread in the moderate heat. Finally, when only coals remained, they'd start slow cooking stews that would simmer all night. The measuring system would drive modern cooks completely insane. Recipes called for a handful of flour, a pinch of salt or butter, the size of a walnut. Women passed these measurements down by showing their daughters exactly how much a proper handful looked like in their specific hands. A small woman's handful was different from a large woman's handful, which meant recipes varied from family to family, even when using identical ingredients. Salt was measured in pinches because it was more valuable than gold in some frontier areas. Sugar came in hard blocks that had to be scraped or chipped off with knives. Families would save every tiny sugar crystal because running out meant months of completely flavorless food. Honey was liquid gold, literally worth its weight in trade goods. Testing doneness required all 5 senses working together. Bread was ready when it sounded hollow, when tapped with a knuckle. Meat was done when the juices ran clear instead of red. Stews were perfect when the vegetables broke apart easily with a wooden spoon. There were no shortcuts, no quick fixes. Everything took time, attention, and experience that could only come from years of mistakes. Cast iron maintenance was a life or death skill that modern people would struggle with. These pots had to be seasoned with animal fat to prevent rusting. After every use, they were scrubbed with coarse salt and dried completely over the fire. A rusted Dutch oven meant food would taste metallic and potentially cause sickness. Some families treated their Dutch ovens better than their furniture, because furniture couldn't keep them alive through winter. The real genius was cooking multiple foods simultaneously in layers. Potatoes went on the bottom because they took longest to cook. Meat sat in the middle where it could brown properly. Quick cooking vegetables were added near the end. Bread could bake in a smaller pot nestled inside the larger one, using the same coals for double efficiency. One fire, one set of coals, 4 different foods cooking at once. Then there was the bread problem that plagued every frontier family. Sourdough starter was temperamental in winter cold. Yeast died if it got too cold or too hot. Women would sleep with their sourdough crocks to keep the starter alive using body heat. Some wrapped the containers in quilts and placed them near the fire, but not too close. Finding that perfect temperature zone meant the difference between fresh bread and rock-hard failure. Water management became critical during cooking. Every drop had to be hauled from wells or melted from snow, which required burning precious fuel. Smart cooks reused cooking water multiple times. Water used to boil potatoes became the base for soup. Water from cleaning vegetables went to the animals. Nothing was wasted because waste meant death. The strangest part was cooking in cabins so small that smoke from the stove filled the entire living space. Families cooked, ate, and slept in the same room where bacon grease splattered and onions made everyone's eyes water. Ventilation was primitive, just cracks around doors and windows that also let in freezing winter air. But all this cooking without modern conveniences was just the beginning of winter survival challenges. Because even with perfect cooking skills, homesteaders still faced diseases that could kill entire families when their winter diet lacked essential nutrients. When families lived on nothing but hardtack, salt pork and dried corn for months, their bodies started breaking down in ways they couldn't understand. The human body needs specific nutrients to function properly, but most homesteaders had never heard of vitamins or minerals. They just knew that people got sick in winter and died from mysterious illnesses that seemed to come from nowhere. Scurvy hit first. Families who went 3 months without fresh fruits or vegetables watched their teeth fall out. Their gums turned black and swollen. Old wounds that had healed years ago suddenly reopened and wouldn't stop bleeding. Children's legs became so weak they couldn't walk. Parents thought it was some kind of curse or punishment, but it was just their bodies running out of vitamin C. The cure was sitting right outside their cabins. Pine needles contain more vitamin C than oranges, but most settlers didn't know this simple fact. Native tribes had used pine needle tea for generations, yet many homesteading families died within walking distance of trees that could have saved their lives. Those who learned this trick from indigenous neighbors survived winters that killed their more stubborn counterparts. Then there was night blindness, which sounds minor until you realize how dangerous it became. Fathers couldn't see to tend animals after dark. Mothers stumbled around their own kitchens. Children fell into wells or wandered off cliffs they couldn't see in dim light. This happened when families ate nothing but corn and flour for weeks without any meat or dairy. Their eyes needed vitamin A to work properly, but cornmeal and hardtack contained almost none. The weird part is that butter could fix this problem completely. Just 1 tablespoon of butter every few days provided enough vitamin A to keep eyes working normally. But butter was expensive and spoiled quickly, so families saved it for special occasions, while their vision slowly deteriorated. Many homesteaders went partially blind, trying to save money on something that cost pennies per day. Pellagra was the killer that confused everyone. Families eating plenty of food still wasted away like they were starving. Their skin developed dark, scaly patches. They couldn't think straight and became confused about simple tasks. Some went completely insane before dying. Doctors didn't understand what caused it, but certain families seemed cursed while others stayed healthy eating similar diets. The difference was how they prepared their corn. Mexican and Native American families soaked corn in ash water or lime before grinding it into meal. This process, called nixtamalization, released nutrients that human bodies could actually use. Settlers who just ground raw corn into meal weren't getting proper nutrition even when eating large quantities. Their bodies couldn't access the niacin trapped inside untreated corn kernels. Rickets turned children into cripples during long, dark winters. Kids who spent months indoors without sunlight developed soft, bent bones that never straightened properly. Their legs curved inward, their spines hunched over, their skulls grew in strange shapes. Parents watched healthy children become deformed and assumed it was God's will or bad luck. But here's what's really heartbreaking. These kids just needed sunlight and a little bit of fish or milk. Vitamin D from sunshine helped their bodies use calcium to build strong bones. Families living near streams could have prevented rickets by feeding children small fish bones and all. Instead, they carefully removed every bone and threw away the part that could have kept their kids healthy. Scurvy killed adults within 4 months, but it took 6 months to kill children. Night blindness developed after 8 weeks without vitamin A. Pellagra needed 3 months of untreated corn diet to become fatal. Rickets took a full winter to permanently deform growing bones. These timelines meant that families often figured out solutions too late to help the people who were already sick. Some homesteaders accidentally discovered cures through desperation. Families who ate rose hips because they had nothing else avoided scurvy completely. Those who chewed on cattail roots got enough vitamin A to maintain their vision. People who ate whole small animals, bones and organs included, stayed healthier than those who ate only muscle meat. The cruelest irony was that knowledge could travel hundreds of miles faster than the diseases it prevented. A neighbor might know that sauerkraut prevented scurvy, but by the time this information reached a family showing symptoms, their teeth were already falling out. Letters describing successful winter diets arrived at homesteads where people had already died from malnutrition. Women developed their own networks for sharing nutritional wisdom, though they didn't call it that. They traded recipes that kept the family strong or prevented winter sickness. These informal exchanges saved more lives than any doctor's advice because frontier women learned what actually worked through trial and deadly error. Understanding which foods prevented disease was literally the difference between having healthy children in spring versus burying them before the snow melted. But even families who survived vitamin deficiency diseases faced another terrifying challenge when their regular food supplies ran completely out. When regular food supplies ran dangerously low, homesteaders turned to sources that would make most modern people gag. Desperation has a way of making the impossible seem perfectly reasonable. Tree bark became flour, leather boots transformed into soup, grass turned into salad, basswood and birch bark were the most common emergency flour substitutes. Families stripped the inner bark, dried it completely, then ground it into powder using whatever tools they had. The result tasted like sawdust mixed with bitter medicine, but it filled empty stomachs. Some clever homesteaders discovered that mixing bark flour with regular flour could stretch their precious wheat supplies for weeks longer than expected. Leather provided another desperate protein source when starvation knocked on cabin doors. Boots, belts and harnesses got chopped up and boiled for hours until they became somewhat edible. The leather had to be scraped clean first, then soaked to remove the worst of the tanning chemicals. What remained was a tough, chewy mess that tasted like salted cardboard, but it contained enough nutrition to keep people breathing. Then there were the weeds and grasses that grew everywhere across the frontier. Dandelion greens, lamb's quarters, and purslane could be found even under snow if you knew where to look. Prairie grass seeds were gathered and ground into a gritty paste that barely qualified as food. Wild onions added some flavor to these desperate meals. though finding them required digging through frozen ground with whatever tools survived the winter. The most heartbreaking emergency food source involved family pets and livestock that weren't producing. Chickens that stopped laying eggs became Sunday dinner. Dogs and cats that couldn't earn their keep through hunting became protein when human survival was at stake. These decisions tore families apart emotionally, but dead pets meant living children. Cannibalism represents the absolute bottom of frontier desperation, though it happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. The Donner Party became the most famous example, but they weren't alone. Isolated families facing starvation sometimes made choices that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. Bodies of family members who died from cold or disease sometimes became the only thing standing between the living and death. Wild rose hips provided emergency vitamin C when scurvy threatened to kill everyone. These bright red fruits stayed on bushes well into winter, and could be eaten raw or boiled into tea. They tasted incredibly sour, almost like eating a lemon, but they prevented the bleeding gums and loose teeth that killed so many frontier families. Pine needle tea became another scurvy-fighting emergency drink. The needles had to be fresh, not brown or dried out, and they were steeped in hot water for several minutes. The resulting tea tasted like drinking Christmas tree, but it contained enough vitamin C to keep people healthy. Native tribes had used this technique for centuries, and smart homesteaders learned quickly. Cattail roots offered another emergency carbohydrate source for families who knew how to find them. These roots grew in marshy areas, and could be dug up even when the surface was frozen. After cleaning and drying, they could be ground into a starchy powder that worked like potato flour. The taste was bland and slightly sweet, making it one of the more palatable emergency foods. Some desperate families turned to clay eating when nothing else was available. Certain types of clay contained minerals that helped settle empty stomachs, though they provided no real nutrition. This practice, called geophagy, had been used by various cultures throughout history, but it was always a sign of severe desperation. Acorns became emergency food for families living near oak trees. The nuts had to be processed carefully to remove bitter tannins that could make people sick. This involved crushing the acorns, then soaking them in water for days while changing the water repeatedly. The final product could be ground into a bitter flour that was better than nothing. Ice fishing provided emergency protein when families lived near frozen streams or ponds. Even tiny fish could be stretched into soup when combined with whatever vegetables remained in storage. The challenge was cutting through thick ice using primitive tools, then staying warm long enough to catch anything worthwhile. Bone marrow became a precious source of fat and protein when meat ran out. Families cracked open every bone from previous meals to scrape out the soft interior. This marrow could be eaten raw, cooked into soup, or mixed with other emergency foods to add crucial calories and flavor. The weird part is how quickly people adapted to eating these emergency foods. After a few weeks of desperation, tree bark soup started tasting almost normal. Leather stew became just another meal. The human body's ability to survive on practically nothing remains one of the most remarkable aspects of homesteader life. Understanding these emergency food sources gives us insight into just how close to disaster most frontier families lived every single winter. But even when families survived on emergency rations, they still needed ways to prepare and cook these unusual ingredients safely. Getting meat to last through winter without modern refrigeration meant mastering techniques that would make today's food scientists nervous. Homesteaders couldn't just toss a roast in the freezer and call it good. They had to transform fresh kills into leather-tough jerky, salt-crusted bacon, and smoke-blackened hams that could survive months without spoiling. Smoking meat was like tending a cranky baby for 3 straight days. The fire couldn't get too hot or the meat would cook instead of cure. Too cold and bacteria would turn your winter protein supply into a toxic mess. Settlers built smokehouses from whatever they could find: old barrels, lean-to sheds, even holes dug into hillsides. The key was maintaining that perfect temperature sweet spot between 80 and 90 degrees Fahrenheit while keeping steady smoke rolling. Hickory was the gold standard for smoking, but on the prairie where trees were scarce, families burned whatever they could find. Corn cobs worked surprisingly well. So did dried buffalo chips, though nobody talked about that at dinner parties back east. The weird part is that different materials created distinct flavors. Apple wood gave meat a sweet taste, while oak produced a stronger, more robust flavor that could mask the gamey taste of wild venison. Salt curing required a completely different approach and way more salt than most families wanted to spend. Picture covering an entire side of pork with salt so thick it looked like it had been buried in snow. The salt drew every drop of moisture from the meat, creating an environment where harmful bacteria simply couldn't survive. But here's the catch. You needed roughly 1 pound of salt for every 3 pounds of meat. When salt cost more than gold in some frontier towns, this preservation method could bankrupt a family. The process took weeks of patience most hungry homesteaders didn't have. First, the meat got packed in salt for several days, then it was hung to air dry in a cool, ventilated space. Every few days, someone had to check for signs of spoilage or insect infestation. One fly laying eggs in your salt pork meant losing weeks of work and precious protein. Sun drying worked fastest but demanded perfect weather conditions that frontier families couldn't control. Meat had to be sliced paper thin and spread on makeshift racks made from branches or wagon parts. The slices needed constant air circulation and protection from insects. Women would wave blankets over drying meat to keep flies away, sometimes for hours at a time. Rain could ruin days of work in minutes, turning carefully prepared jerky into moldy garbage. Native American tribes taught many settlers the art of making pemmican mole, a concentrated survival food that combined dried meat with rendered fat and sometimes berries. The fat acted as a natural preservative, while providing crucial calories for surviving harsh winters. One handful of properly made pemmican contained more energy than a full bowl of vegetable stew, but making it required rendering animal fat at exactly the right temperature, then mixing it with powdered dried meat in precise ratios. Fermentation might sound gross to modern ears, but it kept meat edible when other methods failed. Families would pack meat in containers with salt brine, then let naturally occurring bacteria do the preservation work. The process created an acidic environment that prevented dangerous bacteria from growing. German settlers brought sauerkraut-making knowledge that they adapted for preserving small pieces of meat and sausages. Each preservation technique demanded specific tools that most homesteading families had to improvise. Sharp knives were absolutely essential. Dull blades tore meat fibers and created surfaces where bacteria could hide. Many families spent winter evenings sharpening knives by hand, knowing that poorly prepared meat could kill everyone before spring arrived. Wooden smoking racks had to be built from scratch using whatever materials were available. Temperature control separated successful preservation from deadly mistakes. Meat that got too warm during the curing process became a breeding ground for botulism and other toxins that killed entire families. Homesteaders learned to judge temperature by holding their hands near smoking fires and counting how long they could stand the heat. 5 seconds meant the temperature was perfect for jerky. Less than 3 seconds was too hot. Then there was the constant battle against scavengers and insects. Bears could smell curing meat from miles away and would tear apart smokehouses to get at winter protein stores. Flies laid eggs in exposed meat faster than families could wave them away. Mice and rats gnawed through supposedly secure storage containers. Some families built elaborate systems of hanging meat high in trees, only to discover that raccoons were excellent Winter's freezing temperatures became nature's refrigerator, but even that required careful management. Meat that froze and thawed repeatedly developed ice crystals that destroyed texture and created entry points for bacteria. The smartest homesteaders learned to use cold storage strategically, keeping some meat frozen solid while actively preserving other portions using smoking and salt curing methods. But all these preservation techniques meant nothing without proper storage containers and locations that could protect months of hard work from moisture, pests and temperature swings. When the men froze to death during brutal blizzards or got trampled by stampeding cattle, guess who had to figure out how to keep the family alive? The women. And let me tell you, frontier women didn't have the luxury of falling apart. They had about 24 hours to transform from cook and caretaker into hunter, trapper, and meat processor, or watch their children starve. Most women arrived on the frontier knowing how to bake bread and maybe preserve some fruit. Suddenly they're staring down a winter that could last 6 months, holding a rifle they've never fired, with 3 kids looking at them like they're supposed to have all the answers. Well, they better figure it out fast. The weird part is how quickly desperation turned ordinary housewives into crack shots. Sarah McKinney's husband died of pneumonia in November 1887, leaving her with twin boys and a baby girl in Nebraska. By December, she was tracking rabbits through knee-deep snow with snares she'd twisted from fence wire. By January, she could skin and butcher a deer faster than most men. Her secret? She practiced on every rabbit she caught until her hands moved without thinking. Then there's the recipe knowledge that literally kept families breathing. These weren't casual cooking tips passed down over Sunday dinner. This was life or death information about which wild plants wouldn't poison the kids and how to tell if preserved meat had gone bad. Women memorized the exact salt ratios for curing pork because getting it wrong meant losing 50 pounds of precious protein. Mary Catherine Williams kept a mental cookbook that would shame modern survival experts. She knew that pine needle tea prevented scurvy, how to render bear fat into cooking oil, and which tree barks could be ground into emergency flour. But here's what makes it incredible. She learned most of this stuff from other women who'd figured it out through pure trial and error. Makes sense, right? The learning curve was brutal. Catherine Miller wrote in her diary about burning an entire batch of hardtack because she misjudged the fire temperature. That wasn't just a kitchen mistake, it was potentially a death sentence. Those ingredients couldn't be replaced until spring, assuming they lived that long. Food preparation became an all-consuming obsession that started before dawn and ended after midnight. Women had to plan meals around fuel conservation because every piece of wood burned for cooking was wood that couldn't heat the cabin. They developed techniques like cooking multiple dishes in sequence using the same fire, timing everything perfectly to avoid waste. But why did women specifically become so skilled at this? Simple biology mixed with social expectations. They were already managing the household food supply, so they understood portion control and rationing better than men who focused on hunting and farming. When crisis hit, they already had the foundation, they just had to scale it up to survival mode. Let's not forget the multitasking that would make modern parents weep. While women were teaching their daughters how to set rabbit snares while simultaneously stirring a pot of beans and keeping watch for wolves. Every moment had to serve multiple purposes because there simply weren't enough hours in the winter day. The really impressive part was how they adapted men's hunting techniques to work around their other responsibilities. They couldn't disappear into the wilderness for days tracking elk like their husbands did. Instead, they mastered close-range hunting and trapping methods that let them stay within earshot of crying babies and sick children. Anna Brewington figured out how to smoke venison in her own cabin by rigging a system with her chimney. Sounds crazy, but it worked. She could tend the smoking meat while cooking other meals and watching her 4 kids. Innovation born from absolute necessity, the knowledge transfer between women created unofficial survival networks across the frontier. When Martha Henderson's family was snowed in for 3 weeks, her neighbor Elizabeth rode through a blizzard to teach her how to make nutritious soup from beef bones they'd been throwing away. That information sharing saved entire families. More women also became experts at stretching ingredients in ways that defied logic. They could make one chicken last a week by using every part, meat for the first meal, bones for broth, even grinding up the dried bones for calcium powder to prevent rickets in growing children. And the weird part is, many women became better hunters than their husbands had ever been. They couldn't rely on brute force, so they developed patience and strategy. They studied animal behavior, learned to read tracks and became absolutely deadly with snares and small caliber weapons. The psychological pressure was unimaginable. These women knew that one bad decision about food storage or preparation could kill everyone they loved. Yet somehow, they managed to keep families fed, healthy and alive through winters that challenged every survival skill imaginable. Their success rate determined everything, whether the family would continue homesteading or abandon their claim in defeat. But even the most skilled women couldn't overcome every challenge winter threw at families, especially when it came to keeping the smallest and most vulnerable members fed and healthy through the brutal cold months ahead. When frontier children complained about dinner, they weren't whining about broccoli. They were facing the brutal reality that their tiny bodies needed more food than their families could provide. Winter meant watching adults eat while knowing their own portions would be smaller, sometimes dangerously so. Most homestead children ate exactly what the adults ate, just less of it. That hardtack everyone choked down. Kids got half a piece. The watery stew made from salt pork and whatever vegetables remained in storage. Children received smaller bowls while their parents pretended they weren't still hungry. Makes sense from a survival standpoint, right? Adults needed strength to hunt, chop wood, and protect the family, but growing children's bodies were literally eating themselves to stay alive. The math was cruel and simple. A typical homestead family might have 200 pounds of flour for the entire winter, with 6 people to feed, including 3 children. Every ounce had to be calculated. Children under 10 received roughly 2/3 of an adult portion. Teenagers got 3/4. The smallest kids often survived on what amounted to starvation rations by today's standards. Then there's the heartbreaking reality of protein distribution. When a rabbit was caught or a precious piece of bacon was cooked, the adults ate the meat while children got the broth and whatever scraps remained. Parents convinced themselves that children's smaller stomachs needed less, but the truth was simpler. Adults would die faster without adequate nutrition, and dead parents meant dead children. Children learned to stretch their food in ways that would horrify modern parents. They'd chew hardtack slowly, making each bite last minutes. Some kids saved half their daily ration for bedtime, knowing they'd sleep better with something in their stomachs. Others learned to fill up on hot water before meals to feel fuller on less food. Frontier children became experts at hunger management before they could read. The weird part is how quickly kids adapted to foods that would make today's children gag. 5-year-olds learned to enjoy salt pork fat spread on hardtack like it was candy. They'd beg for sips of coffee because the warmth and slight sweetness felt like a treat. Prairie children got excited about finding wild onions the way modern kids get excited about finding Easter eggs. But let's not ignore what this diet did to growing bodies. Malnutrition was so common that stunted growth became normal in frontier communities. Children who survived these winters often remained smaller than they should have been for their entire lives. Their teeth came in crooked or not at all. Some developed rickets, leaving them with bowed legs and weakened bones that never fully recovered. Winter scurvy hit children harder than adults. While parents might notice loose teeth or bleeding gums, children developed the disease faster and more severely. Smart mothers saved any dried fruit specifically for their kids, understanding that a child's death from scurvy could happen within weeks of the first symptoms appearing. The responsibility placed on frontier children would shock modern families. Kids as young as 6 learned to set rabbit snares. 7-year-olds knew how to skin small game and prepare it for cooking. By age 8, most children could identify edible plants and knew which tree bark could be ground into emergency flour. These weren't cute pioneer skills. They were literal life or death knowledge that determined whether families survived. Child mortality during winter months was devastating. Families regularly lost their youngest members to a combination of malnutrition, cold, and disease. Parents made horrible choices about which children got the last bit of food or the warmest sleeping spot. Some families lost half their children during particularly harsh winters, and surviving siblings grew up understanding that death was always one blizzard away. Food accidents hit children differently too. Adults knew to soak hardtack until it was soft, but hungry children often tried to eat it dry and choked. Kids burned their tongues on scalding coffee or stew because they were too eager to get something warm in their bellies. Some children ate spoiled meat because they couldn't tell the difference, leading to food poisoning that their weakened bodies couldn't fight off. Yet these same children developed incredible resilience. They learned to hunt, fish, trap, and forage with skills that put most adults to shame. 10-year-olds could track rabbits through snow, identify bird nests, and catch fish with their bare hands. Necessity turned children into survival experts who often became the most capable hunters in their families. The children who survived these brutal winters carried the knowledge forward. They became the parents who knew exactly how much food to store, which preservation methods worked best, and how to keep their own children alive when nature tried to kill them. But survival came with invisible scars that lasted lifetimes. Speaking of lasting damage, the physical and psychological effects of winter malnutrition didn't disappear when spring arrived. What happened to families when their carefully preserved food finally ran out completely? Death came fast on the frontier, and food was often the culprit. Homesteaders faced dangers they never imagined back east. Spoiled meat that looked fine could kill an entire family within days. Bad water turned into deadly dysentery outbreaks that swept through settlements like wildfire. Food poisoning hit hard and fast in winter. Families couldn't just run to a doctor when someone got sick from rotten meat. The nearest medical help might be 50 miles away through impassable snow. One bad piece of pork meant watching your loved ones suffer and die while you stood helpless. Settlers learned to smell everything twice and trust their instincts about questionable food. Contaminated water killed more homesteaders than Indian attacks ever did. Slough water looked crystal clear but carried typhoid, cholera, and dysentery. Families who skipped boiling their water to save fuel often paid the ultimate price. Children died first, their small bodies unable to fight off the diseases that contaminated water brought to their doorstep. Then there were the cooking accidents that turned daily survival into deadly gambles. Open fires and wood stoves burned constantly during winter months. Women worked around these flames while wearing long dresses and aprons. One wrong move meant clothing caught fire, and burns in the middle of nowhere usually meant death. Families lost mothers to cooking fires, leaving children and husbands unable to prepare food properly. Hardtack created its own special kind of danger. These rock-hard biscuits could crack teeth or lodge in throats. Desperate, hungry people tried eating hardtack too fast and choked to death on something meant to save their lives. The irony was bitter. Families survived months of careful rationing only to lose someone to a piece of bread eaten too quickly. Storage mistakes attracted the wrong kind of visitors. Improperly stored food drew bears, wolves, and other predators right to cabin doors. Bears could smell bacon grease from miles away and would tear through cabin walls to reach it. Families woke up to find massive predators destroying their winter food supplies and threatening their lives. Poor storage didn't just waste food, it invited death into your home. Wells freezing solid created water emergencies that killed people in unexpected ways. Desperate families chopped through thick ice to reach water below. Many fell through weak ice and drowned in their own wells. Others died from exposure while trying to melt enough snow to keep their families hydrated. Water seemed simple until winter turned it into a life or death challenge. Let's not forget the deadly mistakes of preservation gone wrong. Families who didn't understand proper smoking or salting techniques created perfect conditions for botulism and other food-borne illnesses. The meat looked fine, smelled acceptable, but contained invisible killers. Entire families died slow, agonizing deaths from toxins in food they worked so hard to preserve. Hunting accidents claimed lives when desperate people took unnecessary risks. Hungry settlers climbed dangerous cliffs chasing rabbits or ventured onto thin ice pursuing waterfowl. Ammunition was precious, so people got too close to wounded animals and paid with their lives. Winter hunting meant life or death decisions, and one wrong choice could end everything. Root cellars became death traps when built incorrectly. Poor ventilation created pockets of deadly gas that suffocated people checking on stored vegetables. Families found fathers and sons dead in their own food storage areas, killed by invisible gases from rotting produce. The very places meant to preserve life became underground tombs. But the weird part is how many families died from eating things that weren't actually food. Desperate hunger drove people to consume leather, tree bark, and even stranger substances. These emergency food sources caused intestinal blockages that killed slowly and painfully. Starvation made people take risks that common sense should have prevented. Kitchen tools themselves became weapons of accidental death. Sharp knives used for butchering caused fatal cuts when people worked with frozen, numb fingers. Cast iron cookware split skulls when poorly secured pot hooks failed. Every tool essential for survival could just as easily end a life in careless hands. Temperature extremes created their own deadly scenarios. Food that froze solid in storage areas shattered teeth when people tried eating it too quickly. Scalding stews and boiling water caused burns that became infected without proper medical treatment. The same cold that preserved meat also killed people who couldn't maintain proper body heat while preparing meals. Even sharing food between families created deadly consequences when diseases spread through contaminated supplies. One family's illness became everyone's death sentence when they shared infected preserves or contaminated water. Generosity and community spirit sometimes backfired in the most tragic ways possible. The frontier demanded perfection in food handling when perfection was nearly impossible. One small mistake in preservation, cooking, or storage could doom entire families. Every meal represented calculated risks that city folks never faced. Death lurked in every aspect of winter food survival, but smart homesteaders learned from others' fatal mistakes. Those who survived developed almost supernatural awareness of food safety. These hard-learned lessons would prove essential as families planned their survival strategies around the changing seasons and the critical timing that determined who lived and who didn't make it through their first frontier winter. When winter hit the frontier, timing became a matter of life and death. Most homesteaders discovered this brutal truth too late their first year. August marked the beginning of the survival countdown. Smart families started their food preparation marathon the moment they spotted the first hint of cooler nights. The math was simple but unforgiving. 3 months to gather enough food for 6 months of winter. No pressure, right? Prairie families worked 18-hour days during these critical months. Women hauled buckets of vegetables from gardens while men butchered livestock before the first frost could ruin everything. Children as young as 6 learned to slice apples paper-thin for drying. Everyone understood that every wasted day in August meant hunger in January. September brought the real panic. Experienced homesteaders called it Preservation Month because families had to preserve everything they could get their hands on. Smoking houses ran around the clock. Salt barrels emptied as fast as families could afford to refill them. The smell of drying meat hung over settlements like a smoky blanket. Then there was the psychological pressure of watching your neighbors. Families kept mental tallies of who seemed prepared and who looked worried. The Johnsons might have enough salt pork, but did they dry enough corn? The Millers had plenty of root vegetables, but their meat supply looked dangerously low. These observations weren't gossip, they were survival intelligence. October delivered the final deadline. The first hard frost could arrive any day, ending all outdoor preservation work instantly. Families raced against nature's clock, knowing that frozen vegetables couldn't be properly processed. Many settlers stayed up all night during the last warm days, desperately trying to finish smoking the last of their meat supplies. Weather watching became an obsession during these months. Homesteaders studied cloud patterns like their lives depended on it, because they did. A surprise early frost could destroy weeks of careful preparation. One Montana family lost their entire apple harvest when frost hit 3 days before they planned to finish drying. They survived that winter, but barely. The weird part is how different the timing was depending on where families settled. Northern homesteaders had to start their preservation work in July, while those further south could sometimes stretch into November. Altitude mattered too. Mountain families learned that elevation could mean the difference between having enough time and starving. Smart families developed what they called backup timing. If the main potato harvest looked ready in late September, they'd start digging in mid-September just to be safe. Better to have slightly smaller potatoes than to lose everything to an unexpected freeze. This conservative approach saved countless lives, even though it meant smaller food supplies. Children learned to read the seasonal signs as accurately as any adult. They knew that when geese started flying south, preservation time was running out fast. When morning frost started appearing on windows, all outdoor food work had to stop immediately. These natural calendars were more reliable than any pocket watch. Let's not forget the families who got the timing completely wrong. Newcomers from warmer climates often didn't start their food preparation until September. By then, experienced neighbors would shake their heads sadly, knowing these families were probably doomed. The frontier didn't give second chances for poor timing. Spring timing was just as critical as fall preparation, but in reverse. Families had to calculate exactly when their preserved food supplies would run out. Running out of food in March meant 2 months until fresh vegetables could grow. Running out in May meant they might actually survive on wild greens and early plants. The counting became obsessive as winter dragged on. Women would literally count individual pieces of dried meat, calculating how many days each piece could feed the family. Children learned to count potato portions and estimate how long the root cellar supplies would last. These mathematical skills meant the difference between living and dying. April and May were the cruelest months for timing mistakes. Families who had miscalculated their food preservation faced starvation just as warmer weather returned. Many homesteaders died within sight of spring, their bodies too weakened by months of inadequate nutrition to recover even when fresh food became available. Weather patterns made timing even more unpredictable. A late spring could extend winter food needs by weeks. An early winter could catch families before they'd finished their preparation work. Homesteaders learned to prepare for the worst-case scenario in both directions, knowing that optimistic timing killed families. Successful frontier families developed multi-generational timing knowledge. Grandmothers would pass down information about seasonal patterns, frost dates, and optimal preservation schedules. This accumulated wisdom often meant the difference between family survival and tragedy. The most experienced homesteaders started planning their timing before they even planted their spring crops. They'd calculate backwards from expected first frost dates, determining exactly when each type of food preservation had to begin. This level of planning separated the survivors from the casualties. But even perfect timing couldn't prepare families for the psychological challenge of eating the same preserved foods day after day. Understanding seasonal food timing was just the first step towards surviving frontier winters. The real challenge was having the right tools to turn those preserved ingredients into edible meals. Surviving winter on the frontier meant having the right tools, and most families learned this lesson the hard way. A dull knife could mean the difference between preserving enough meat to last until spring or watching precious protein rot away. The families who made it through those brutal months weren't just lucky, they had figured out which tools were absolutely essential and which ones were just taking up space in their already cramped cabins. Sharp knives topped every homesteader's survival list. These weren't the kitchen knives you'd find today. Frontier knives had to butcher entire deer, slice paper-thin strips of meat for jerky, and carve through frozen game that was harder than wood. Men spent winter evenings sharpening blades on whetstones, knowing that tomorrow's meal might depend on making clean cuts through tough prairie chicken or rabbit. A sharp knife worked faster, and speed mattered when you were processing meat in freezing temperatures with wolves howling nearby. Cast iron cookware ruled the frontier kitchen, and for good reason. These heavy pots and pans could handle direct flame, retain heat for hours, and last decades without breaking. Dutch ovens were the superstars of cast iron. They could fry bacon for breakfast, bake hardtack for lunch, and simmer stew for dinner. The thick iron walls distributed heat evenly, preventing the burned spots that could ruin a precious meal. Families treated their cast iron like family heirlooms because replacing them meant waiting months for supply wagons that might never come. Well, maintaining cast iron in winter presented its own challenges. Water froze solid in cabins, making it impossible to wash pots properly. Smart homesteaders wiped their cookware clean with snow, then heated it over the fire to kill bacteria. The seasoning on well-used cast iron actually improved the flavor of food, creating a natural non-stick surface that made cooking with minimal fat easier. Wooden barrels stored the bulk foods that kept families alive. Flour, cornmeal, salt and beans all needed protection from moisture, rodents and freezing temperatures. These barrels weren't just containers, they were engineered storage systems. Wood expanded when wet, creating airtight seals that kept precious supplies fresh. A family's 50-pound flour barrel represented 2 months of survival, so protecting it meant everything. Hand-crank meat grinders turned tough game meat into manageable food. Prairie deer and elk were leaner and tougher than farm animals, making them nearly impossible to chew when simply roasted. Grinding the meat allowed families to make sausages, meat patties, and stews that were actually edible. These grinders also processed fat and gristle that would otherwise be wasted, turning every part of an animal into usable food. The grinding process took serious muscle power. Whole families took turns cranking the handle while someone fed strips of frozen meat into the machine. Kids learned to operate grinders as soon as they were strong enough, because processing large game was a race against time and spoilage. Food storage containers made from every available material served specific purposes. Cloth sacks held dried beans and cornmeal. Ceramic crocks fermented vegetables and stored salt pork. Wooden boxes kept hardtack dry and protected from hungry mice. Each container had to withstand freezing temperatures without cracking or breaking, because replacement containers wouldn't arrive until spring supply wagons. Then there were the specialized tools that separated successful homesteaders from those who didn't make it. Meat smokers, built from scrap wood and metal, could preserve entire deer in a matter of days. Cheese presses turned precious milk into food that lasted months. Hand-operated butter churns provided essential fats during the coldest weather. Makeshift tools often worked better than store-bought equipment. Families carved wooden spoons from scrap lumber, knowing that metal spoons would freeze to your lips in winter. They built drying racks from bent branches to hang jerky strips safely above ground level. Every successful tool had to serve multiple purposes. A large pot might cook stew, wash clothes, and melt snow for drinking water. The weird part is how creative desperation made people. Broken wagon parts became meat hooks. Torn canvas turned into food storage bags. Old horseshoes were reshaped into pot handles. Homesteaders developed an almost supernatural ability to see potential tools in the most unlikely objects. Tool maintenance consumed hours of wintertime, but families who neglected their equipment paid deadly prices. Rust could destroy metal tools in weeks. Wooden handles split in extreme cold. Knife blades chipped on frozen meat if they weren't properly tempered. Smart families spent blizzard days repairing and improving their tools, knowing that spring would bring new challenges requiring perfectly functioning equipment. Quality tools cost serious money that most homesteading families didn't have. A good knife might cost a month's wages. Cast iron Dutch ovens were family investments that got passed down through generations. Many families made do with improvised equipment for years, slowly upgrading when they could afford better tools. But tools were only as good as the knowledge behind them, and learning proper food preparation techniques often meant the difference between thriving and barely surviving through winter's harsh grip. Where you lived on the frontier made all the difference between eating well and eating dirt. Literally, the same family that thrived in Minnesota might starve in Arizona using identical survival methods. Geography wasn't just about pretty views, it determined whether you'd see spring or become fertilizer for the prairie grass. Northern homesteaders lived like Arctic survivors half the year. Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Dakota Territory families faced winters that could freeze spit before it hit the ground. These folks became fish preservation experts by necessity. When lakes froze 3 feet thick, ice fishing became a daily ritual. Families would cut holes through solid ice and drop lines for hours, catching enough fish to smoke and salt for months. Northern pike, walleye, and lake trout were stuffed into barrels with coarse salt, creating protein reserves that lasted until April thaw. The weird part: fish actually preserved better in extreme cold than other meats. All southern families struggled with spoilage. Northern settlers could hang fish in unheated sheds where they'd freeze solid within hours. These human popsicles of protein could be thawed and cooked months later without going bad. Some families ate fish 3 times daily during the harshest months. Then there's the maple syrup advantage northern families enjoyed. Sugar maples don't grow in desert climates, obviously. February sap runs gave northern homesteaders liquid gold when other sweeteners had vanished. They'd tap dozens of trees, boiling sap in massive kettles over outdoor fires. 40 gallons of sap made 1 gallon of syrup, back-breaking work that meant survival. This natural sugar powered children through growth spurts when other nutrition was scarce. Southern homesteaders dealt with completely different challenges and advantages. Texas, Arkansas, and Oklahoma families had growing seasons that stretched into November. While northern folks were already eating preserved foods, southern settlers were still harvesting sweet potatoes, turnips, and late beans. But longer growing seasons meant shorter preservation windows and different spoilage problems. Southern families mastered different preservation techniques out of necessity. Their winters were too warm for reliable meat freezing, so they became smoking and salt curing experts. Smokehouses in the South were elaborate structures with carefully controlled ventilation systems. Ham and bacon could hang in these buildings for months without spoiling, something impossible in northern climates where temperature swings would ruin the curing process. Well, mountain families faced unique challenges that flatland settlers never imagined. Colorado, Montana, and Wyoming homesteaders dealt with altitude problems that affected everything from cooking to breathing. Water boiled at lower temperatures in thin mountain air, meaning beans took twice as long to soften, and bread refused to rise properly. Many families never figured out these altitude adjustments and ate poorly cooked food all winter. But mountain settlers had exclusive access to game that didn't exist elsewhere. Elk, mountain sheep, and bear provided massive amounts of fat and protein unavailable to prairie families. A single elk could feed a family for months, and bear fat was prized for cooking and lamp oil. Mountain streams provided fresh trout year-round through ice fishing, while prairie families had no reliable water sources. Desert homesteaders developed the most creative water conservation methods because they had to or die. Arizona and New Mexico families collected every drop of morning dew using canvas collectors. They learned to locate underground springs and built elaborate catchment systems for brief desert storms. These folks ate more cactus, yucca root, and desert plants than families in other regions ever saw. Makes sense, right? Desert families couldn't rely on traditional root vegetables that needed consistent moisture. Instead, they harvested prickly pear cactus pads and barrel cactus fruit. These desert foods provided surprising nutrition and moisture content. Some families survived entire dry spells eating nothing but various cactus species and whatever small game they could trap. Let's not forget how regional weather patterns shaped food timing differently across territories. Nebraska families might have 8 weeks for fall preparation, while Montana families had 4 weeks before killing frost ended outdoor work. This timing difference meant some regions required completely different preservation schedules and techniques. Plains families dealt with unique challenges that mountain and forest settlers avoided. Grassland fires could destroy months of food preparation in hours. Prairie families learned to create fire breaks around food storage areas and keep emergency supplies in multiple locations. They also faced grasshopper swarms that could devour standing crops overnight, something mountain families never experienced. Coastal families had access to different protein sources entirely. Pacific Northwest homesteaders could harvest salmon runs, collect shellfish, and gather seaweed for nutrition. These ocean foods provided vitamins and minerals that inland families lacked, explaining why coastal settlers had fewer scurvy and nutritional deficiency problems. Regional differences also meant different trading opportunities and supply chains. Families near established trading posts had access to imported foods like coffee, sugar, and spices. Remote mountain families might go years without seeing store-bought supplies, forcing them to develop more self-sufficient food systems than their better-connected neighbors. But regardless of region, every homesteading family faced the same basic challenge: surviving winter without modern conveniences. The specific foods and methods might vary, but the life or death stakes remained identical everywhere. Understanding how different families adapted these regional advantages would determine who lived to tell their survival stories. When winter finally broke, surviving homesteaders faced a bittersweet reality. The snow melted away to reveal families that barely resembled the hopeful settlers who'd arrived months earlier. Spring's arrival meant wild greens would soon push through the thawed ground. Dandelion leaves, lamb's quarters and wild onions became the first fresh foods these families had tasted in months. After surviving on nothing but preserved meat, hardtack and root vegetables, even bitter weeds tasted like luxury. Children would cry with joy at the sight of their first green leaf. But the toll winter had taken was written across every face. Most surviving families had lost between 20 to 40 pounds per person during the harsh months. Men who'd started winter weighing 180 pounds now struggled to lift 140 pounds of weakened muscle and bone. Women had given their food portions to children so many times that their clothes hung like empty sacks. The weird part is how dramatically their bodies had changed beyond just weight loss. Months of vitamin deficiency left permanent marks. Children showed signs of rickets with bowed legs that would never fully straighten. Adults had loose teeth from scurvy, and many would lose them entirely within the next year. Night blindness affected entire families who'd survived on nothing but preserved foods. Then there's the psychological damage that spring couldn't immediately heal. Families had watched neighbors die. They'd eaten things no human should have to eat. Some had made impossible choices about who got the last portions of food. These memories haunted homesteaders long after wildflowers bloomed again. Recovery wasn't automatic just because winter ended. Bodies that had been pushed to starvation's edge couldn't immediately handle normal food portions. Many families had to slowly increase their eating over weeks to avoid making themselves violently sick. Their stomachs had literally shrunk from months of minimal food. Well, let's talk about what spring actually brought to the table. Wild greens provided crucial vitamins, but they weren't calorie-dense. A stomach full of dandelion leaves might provide nutrients, but it wouldn't restore lost weight quickly. Families still faced weeks of careful rationing until their first crops could grow. The successful food preservation techniques these families had learned became their most valuable knowledge. Women who'd mastered smoking meat, men who'd built proper root cellars, and children who'd learned to identify edible wild plants. They'd gained skills worth more than gold. These weren't just survival techniques anymore. They were the foundation for building sustainable homesteads. But here's what most people don't realize about winter survival's aftermath. Many families never fully recovered their health. Chronic malnutrition during those critical winter months led to lifelong digestive problems, weakened immune systems and shortened lifespans. Children who'd gone hungry during crucial growth periods remained smaller and weaker than they should have been. Let's not forget the families who'd made it through, but lost members along the way. Empty chairs at spring tables told stories of grandparents, babies or sick relatives who couldn't survive the harsh months. Surviving didn't always mean everyone survived. The homesteaders who lived to see another spring carried forward hard-earned wisdom. They knew exactly how much food a family needed to make it through winter. They understood which preservation methods worked and which were deadly gambles. Most importantly, they'd learned that successful homesteading meant thinking an entire year ahead, not just getting through the next week. Makes sense, right? Those first-year mistakes, like not digging root cellars deep enough or failing to preserve enough meat, those lessons were written in hunger and loss. Second-year homesteaders were completely different people than the optimistic settlers who'd arrived the previous spring. Some families decided homesteading wasn't worth the risk after experiencing one brutal winter. They packed whatever belongings remained and headed back east or to established towns, but the families who stayed became the backbone of Western expansion. Their children grew up knowing skills that city folks couldn't imagine. The irony is that successful winter survival often meant families could finally start thriving. They'd proven they could handle the worst nature could throw at them. Their food preservation skills meant they'd never face starvation again. Their hunting abilities provided protein year-round. Their knowledge of wild edibles added variety to monotonous preserved foods. Those who survived also became the teachers for new waves of settlers. Experienced homesteaders could look at a family's food preparation in August and predict whether they'd make it through winter. This knowledge sharing created survival networks that dramatically improved homesteading success rates in later years. Spring meant hope, but it also meant reflection on the thin line between life and death that defined frontier winters. Every surviving family understood they'd cheated death through preparation, luck, and sheer determination. They'd learned that successful homesteading wasn't about bravery or adventure. It was about respecting winter's power and preparing accordingly. The end of winter survival marked the true beginning of Western settlement, built on lessons learned through hunger, loss, and ultimately the triumph of human adaptability.